Alright, here's a story that still gives me goosebumps when I think about it. And trust me, I'm not the type to get spooked easy. This was about 6 months ago, middle of summer, right around the time the city was doing those random road repairs that make your GPS completely useless. It started simple. I needed hops. Now, my usual supplier had run into some warehouse issue, and I was in a pinch because we were debuting a new beer, Optimus Prime, at the weekend festival. Long story short, I'm on my way to this little farm an hour out of town that a buddy recommended. Real local stuff, supposed to be top-notch. But of course, half the highways are closed, so I'm weaving through back roads with a printed map because my phone's signal decided to ghost me, and I take a wrong turn. It's not just a wrong turn, though. It's one of those roads where the asphalt turns to gravel, the gravel turns to dirt, and the trees start closing in like they're trying to swallow you. I almost turned back, but then I saw the sign. Well, sign might be generous. It was more like a wooden board nailed to a tree, with Hop Haven scrawled in faded white paint. An arrow pointed further down the path. Against my better judgment, I followed it. After another mile or so, the trees opened up, and there it was, the most idyllic little farm I've ever seen. A field of hops stretching out like a green sea, dotted with sunflowers along the edges. In the middle of it all, a big red barn with a weathered sign hanging above the door that said, Hop Haven, where magic is brewed. I park the car and step out, and immediately, something feels off. Not bad exactly, just strange. The air smells different, sweeter like honey and fresh-cut grass. There's a soft buzzing sound like bees, but I don't see any hives. And the light, it's the middle of the day, but the sunlight feels golden, like that perfect hour before sunset. I head toward the barn, figuring someone must be inside. And as I'm about to knock, the door swings open on its own. Not like a gust of wind. This was slow and deliberate, like an invitation. And yeah, I hesitated, but what was I going to do? I needed those hops. Inside, it's cooler than it should have been, and the smell hits me. Earthy rich with this faint citrusy tang. The place is packed with crates of hops, all neatly labeled with varieties I've never even heard of: Starlight Cascade, Moonveil, Amber Shadow. I'm standing there, trying to figure out if I accidentally wandered into some experimental grow-op, when this man steps out from behind one of the crates. He's tall, with wild gray hair that looks like it's been struck by lightning, and he's wearing overalls over a white button-up shirt. His eyes, here's where it gets weird, are this sharp, pale green like mint leaves caught in the sun. He looks at me, tilts his head, and says, "You're late." I blink. Sorry? I didn't realize I was expected. He grins. Everyone who comes here is expected. Question is, what are you looking for? Cascade hops mostly, I say, holding up the list I'd scribbled down earlier. But I'm open to something new, he interrupts, finishing my sentence like he's known me forever. Before I can respond, he walks over to one of the crates and pulls out a handful of hops. They're the brightest green I've ever seen, almost glowing. "Try these," he says, handing them to me. I take them, half expecting them to be warm or sparkly or something equally bizarre, but they feel normal. Smell normal, too, citrusy, floral, a little piney. "What are these?" I ask. He winks. "The good stuff." At this point, I'm wondering if I've stumbled into some hipster fever dream, but I'm also too intrigued to back out. I ask how much, and he waves me off. "Take what you need," he says. "The first batch is always free." "Free?" I echo, because who gives away hops for free? "You'll pay in stories," he replies, and before I can ask what that means, he's already walking out the door. So I load up my car with a few bags, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. As I'm about to leave, I notice a small sign by the gate that wasn't there when I arrived. It says, "Once you've brewed it, you'll know." Weird, right? But here's where it gets downright spooky. I get back to the pub, unload the hops, and tell my head brewer Sam about the whole thing. We decide to use the new hops for a single keg of IPA, just to see how it turns out. The brew day goes off without a hitch, and when the beer's ready, we tap it for a tasting. The first sip? Incredible. Like transcendent. It's got this layered flavor, bright citrus at the front, then this deep, almost smoky undertone that lingers just enough to make you want more. We're all blown away. I decided to name it Golden Thread because that's what it feels like, a thread connecting everything, somehow. Then the stories start. The first guy to order a pint that night is a regular Tom. Great guy, owns a hardware store down the street. He takes one sip, and his face lights up like he's just remembered something important. "This tastes like summers at my grandparents' cabin," he says. "We used to pick wild blueberries and fish off the dock." He trails off, shaking his head. "Haven't thought about that in years." The next day, a woman orders a pint, and halfway through, she starts tearing up. "It's like my dad's lemon pie," she says. "He passed away 5 years ago, but this is like sitting at the kitchen table with him again." And it keeps happening. Every single person who tries the beer has a story, something personal, something they haven't thought about in ages. It's not just beer. It's like the stuff unlocks memories. Good ones. Warm ones. The kind you tuck away because life gets too busy. We only had the one keg, and by the end of the week, it was gone. I went back to that farm to try and get more, but here's the kicker. The road doesn't exist anymore. No sign, no wooden board nailed to a tree, nothing. Just a dead end where the gravel meets the woods. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was some elaborate prank. Maybe I was just overtired and imagining things. But every time someone talks about how that beer made them feel, I can't help but think about the man in the barn and the way he said, "You'll pay," in stories. I guess I am. I didn't mean to adopt a pigeon. Let me start there. It's not like I woke up one morning and thought, "You know what my life needs? A street bird with trust issues and questionable hygiene." But sometimes the universe gives you things you didn't ask for, like parking tickets or unsolicited advice from strangers. Or in my case, Walter. Walter showed up during my break at the cafe. It was one of those crisp autumn days where the air smells faintly of cinnamon and decaying leaves, and everyone suddenly acts like walking is their new personality. I'd snag a table outside to write in my notebook. You know, my serious comedy notebook where I jot down overheard conversations like a nosy detective. I was mid-sentence, writing something ridiculous a customer had said about oat milk being spiritually lighter, when this scraggly gray pigeon strutted up to me. He had a bald patch on his head, one eye that didn't quite open, and a vibe that screamed retired mob boss. I ignored him, figuring he'd wander off like every other pigeon in Brooklyn. But Walter wasn't every other pigeon. He hopped onto the edge of my table, his beady little eyes locked on my bagel. I tried to shoo him away with a quick wave, but he just tilted his head like, "Seriously? That's all you've got?" I sighed and tore off a piece of bagel, tossing it on the sidewalk, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, he ignored the crumb entirely and took a step closer, like he decided I was the bagel. "All right, buddy," I muttered. "You're pushing it." And that's when it happened. A couple of teenagers on scooters zipped by, way too fast for a crowded street, and one of them yelled, "Yo, look at that ugly bird!" I don't know why it hit me the way it did, but something about their stupid, snotty tone made me want to defend this one-eyed disaster bird with my life. I mean, sure, Walter was ugly, but he was also Walter. He was trying his best, and who were they to judge? So, I did something I didn't expect. I broke off a bigger piece of bagel and set it right in front of him on the table. He stared at me for a long moment, then pecked at it totally unfazed. That's when I decided his name was Walter. He just looked like a Walter. A little grumpy, a little world-weary, but weirdly endearing. Walter hung out with me for the rest of my break, pecking at crumbs and glaring at people walking by, like he was screening them for entry into some exclusive pigeon nightclub. When my time was up, I figured he'd just fly off and become someone else's problem. But as I stood up and gathered my things, he flapped onto my shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I said, freezing in place. I could feel his little claws gripping my jacket, and I prayed he wouldn't poop on me. You can't just claim me. But Walter didn't care about what he could or couldn't do. He was Walter. He'd made a decision. I spent the next 10 minutes trying to coax him off my shoulder, which must have looked insane to everyone around me. A guy walking his dog stopped to laugh and said, "Man, you got a friend for life now." I finally managed to shoo Walter away with a gentle nudge, and he flapped off to a nearby bench. I figured that was the end of it. But when I turned the corner, there he was, hopping along behind me like a tiny, determined shadow. "Are you serious right now?" I muttered. I tried everything. I walked faster. I ducked into a bodega and pretended to browse canned beans I definitely didn't need. But every time I stepped outside, there he was waiting. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was half convinced Walter had imprinted on me like some weird bird movie I didn't sign up for. I didn't let him inside, obviously. But when I peeked out my window later, there he was, perched on the fire escape, looking smug as hell. Like he'd won. And that's how it started. Over the next few days, Walter just stuck around. I'd see him waiting for me outside the cafe or perched on a lamppost during my walk to the comedy club. At first, it was annoying. Like, seriously, what was I supposed to do with a pigeon stalker? But eventually, I started to like having him around. He was weirdly comforting in a way, like a little reminder that I wasn't alone, even on the days when I felt like my jokes were landing with all the grace of a drop plate. One night, after a particularly bad set, I stopped by a hot dog cart on my way home and got a pretzel instead. I tore off a piece and tossed it on the ground for Walter, who'd shown up like clockwork. He pecked at it, then looked up at me like, "You're all right, kid. I bombed tonight," I told him, leaning against the wall. Like bad. Pretty sure the guy in the front row fell asleep. How do you keep showing up for me when I can't even show up for myself? Walter didn't answer, obviously. He was too busy dismantling the pretzel. But something about the way he didn't care about my bad set, or the fact that I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, hit me. Walter wasn't trying to be anything but Walter. And maybe I didn't have to be anything but me. It sounds dumb, but after that night, I started to loosen up. On stage, I stopped trying to be the clever comic who impressed everyone and just started telling the truth. About my life, about the people I met, even about Walter. People laughed, like really laughed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just performing, I was connecting. Walter still pops up now and then. I've started carrying a bag of sunflower seeds in my jacket, just in case he decides to make an appearance. He reminds me to take myself a little less seriously, to laugh at the weird, messy parts of life. And maybe, just maybe, to be a little more like him, scrappy, unbothered, and always showing up. You ever have a moment where something ridiculous, a bird, a random encounter, whatever, just forces you to rethink everything? Because, honestly, I never thought my life's biggest pep talk would come from a one-eyed pigeon named Walter. But here we are. I was halfway through threading a needle when I saw it. The little boy with the cardboard sword. I almost missed him, distracted by a rip in this ridiculous sequin dress someone had donated. Like, who wears that to Target? But there he was, marching down the sidewalk outside my apartment window like a tiny knight on a quest. The sword was just a piece of a box he'd hacked up. The shield was a pizza tray. And his helmet? A plastic mixing bowl with stickers on it. It was the kind of moment that sneaks up on you, and suddenly you're smiling before you even realize why. The best part? His armor was duct tape. Like silver duct tape wrapped around his knees, his elbows, even his chest. He looked like a tinfoil burrito with legs. I wanted to yell down to him, "Sir Duct Tape of the cul-de-sac, where's your dragon?" But he disappeared around the corner before I could get my phone out for a picture. It left me sitting there, holding this neon pink sequin, feeling like I just watched something ancient happen, like a flashback to when kids could turn a cardboard box into a castle and actually believe it. That's the kind of thing I'm obsessed with, how the smallest, most random moments can feel like magic if you catch them just right. It's part of why I keep trying to stitch together a world out of scraps, both literally and figuratively. Working at the thrift store gives me plenty of material to play with. Yesterday, someone donated a bag full of mismatched gloves. Who has that many solo gloves? What happened to all the left hands? I couldn't stop wondering, so I started pairing them up in the weirdest combinations. Leopard print with plaid, leather with lace, and laying them out on the counter. One of my co-workers walked by, saw what I was doing, and said, "That's deeply unsettling." Which, honestly, goal achieved. But it's not just about gloves or duct tape nights. It's about the way the world quietly offers you stories if you're paying attention. Like the other day, I saw this old woman watering a single flower in a cracked pot outside her trailer. One flower. That's it. But she was so careful, so precise, like this little marigold was her whole universe. I don't know why, but it broke my heart in the best way. I started imagining her backstory. Maybe she used to have a huge garden and lost it. Maybe she saved that one flower from somewhere important. Or maybe she just loves marigolds and doesn't care what anyone thinks. I tried to channel that feeling into a jacket I'm working on, a patchwork bomber made entirely of fabric scraps people were going to throw away. There's something rebellious about it, taking things everyone else thinks are trash and making them scream, "Look at me." It's not about perfection, it's about personality. Like, yeah, one sleeve is green corduroy and the other is shiny gold vinyl. And fight me. That jacket is my little defiance against the idea that everything has to match, has to be perfect, has to make sense. Because honestly, life doesn't make sense most of the time. Like yesterday, when a guy came into the store asking if we had any stuffed owls. Not owl toys, actual taxidermy owls. "It's for a project," he said, dead serious, like I was the one being weird for asking questions. I had to laugh. I mean, isn't that the perfect summary of humanity? Somebody out there always needs something bizarre, and somebody else, probably me, will think, what's the story behind this? I'm not saying everything needs to be deep or poetic. Sometimes a cardboard sword is just a cardboard sword. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a reminder that we're all just making it up as we go, trying to bring a little wonder into a world that can feel way too practical. And honestly, I think that's beautiful. So now I've got this habit. Every time I see something that feels like a tiny story, a kid with a duct tape sword, a single marigold in a cracked pot, a mismatched pair of gloves, I write it down in this notebook I carry around. Not for anyone else, just for me. I think of it as a kind of treasure hunting. And if I ever lose the notebook, I hope whoever finds it flips through and realizes how weird and wonderful the world really is. I guess what I'm trying to say is the magic isn't gone. It's just quieter. You have to look for it. You have to listen for it in the sound of duct tape peeling or in the clink of a watering can against a pot. And when you find it, it feels like a gift. So tell me, what's a little piece of magic you found in the middle of your everyday life? Something so small, so random, but so perfect that it felt like it was just for you? This morning, I walked into the corner cafe with my sketchbook under my arm, already half late for my shift, and everything smelled like burnt toast and ambition. There was this guy at the counter arguing with the barista because his cappuccino foam wasn't structured enough. Structured, like we're out here engineering bridges made of dairy. I was too stunned to even roll my eyes properly. The barista just gave him this slow, level blink, the kind you give a toddler about to throw spaghetti on the floor, and said, "Sir, the foam is fine." It was beautiful. I got my coffee and slid into the corner booth, the one where the seat cushion has a weird spring that pokes your thigh, but also the best view of the street. From there, I watched the city do its thing. Construction workers in orange vests hollering across the road. A woman with a dog the size of a loaf of bread, yipping at pigeons like it was trying to defend her honor. A guy on a skateboard whizzing by, wearing a suit jacket and gym shorts. I swear Phoenix mornings are like someone shook up a snow globe full of chaos and dumped it out onto the pavement. Then I saw him. The man with the bucket hat. You know the type. One of those old guys who could be anywhere between 60 and 100, moving slow but deliberate, like he's got all the time in the world and absolutely no intention of rushing. He was pulling a little red wagon behind him, and in the wagon, just a single-potted cactus. A big one, too, with arms and everything. Like the kind you'd see in cartoons if cartoons were about retirees casually transporting desert plants down the sidewalk. I couldn't stop watching him. Where's he taking it? Did the cactus have an appointment? Was it a gift for someone? Or was it, I don't know, his emotional support cactus? I took out my sketchbook and started drawing him right there, shading in the wagon wheels and trying to capture the stoic look on his face. He had this vibe like he'd been doing this same thing for years, like Tuesday was cactus moving day, and we were all just lucky to witness it. By the time he turned the corner and disappeared, I'd already started imagining his whole life. Maybe he used to be a botanist, or a cowboy botanist who fell in love with the desert and decided to spend his retirement ferrying plants around like a one-man parade. That's the thing about this city. It's full of people doing things that don't make any sense if you look at them too hard. Like last week, this woman came into the thrift store where I work part-time, clutching a vase shaped like a penguin. She slammed it down on the counter and said, This is the perfect vase." I didn't even ask what made it so perfect because, honestly, I didn't want to ruin her moment. People get so excited about the weirdest stuff, and I love that about them. It's like we're all walking around with these tiny, private universes in our heads, and sometimes they leak out in the form of a penguin vase or a cactus in a wagon. My own universe leaks out through fabric. I make clothes, not just because I want to be a designer someday, but because it feels like the only way to keep my brain from overflowing. Last night, I found this old denim jacket in the clearance bin at work, the kind with a million little rips and stains that make it look like it fought a lawnmower and lost. Most people would have chucked it in the trash, but I saw potential. I stitched on a patch of this deep red velvet I had lying around, added some gold thread swirls, and now it looks like something a rock star would wear to a concert in an abandoned cathedral. It's not perfect, but neither am I, and honestly, that's kind of the point. I think about that jacket whenever I see people like Bucket Hat Guy or Penguin Vase Lady. They're out here taking their perfectly imperfect lives and making something weird and wonderful out of them. And it reminds me why I keep doing what I do, even when it feels like I'm screaming into the void. Because maybe someday, someone will walk past my little corner of the world, see one of my creations, and stop. Just for a second. Just long enough to think that that's the perfect jacket. By the time I left the cafe, the barista had survived another round of foam complaints. The loaf-sized dog had scared off a pigeon twice its size, and I felt like I'd been let in on a secret. Not a big, dramatic secret, but one of those quiet truths that sits in the back of your mind, waiting for the right moment to pop out. The world doesn't have to make sense to be amazing. It just has to be noticed. So here's my question. What's the last tiny, strange, beautiful thing you noticed? Something that made you stop and think, what's the story here? Because I'm starting to believe that those little moments are the real reason we're all here. To keep noticing, keep wondering, and keep moving our cactuses to wherever they're meant to go. I never planned to fall in love with someone who couldn't sit still. I'm not just talking about tapping her foot or fiddling with her hair. Abby moved through the world like a hummingbird, flitting from one thing to the next, always in motion. She had this habit of walking away mid-sentence, like she trusted I'd either follow her or figure it out later. It was maddening at first, but then one spring afternoon, she walked away and came back with an armful of wildflowers she'd plucked from a ditch by the side of the road. She grinned at me, hair windblown, dirt smudged on her jeans, and I thought, oh, I'm done for. That's how the car ride started. She called them wandering hours. No maps, no plans, just driving. Abby said there was magic in not knowing where the road would take you. If we get lost, we're doing it right, she'd say. At first, I resisted. I'm a planner. I like my routes highlighted, my destinations marked with a star. But Abby had this way of pulling you into her world without even trying. So one day, I found myself behind the wheel with her riding shotgun, folding a paper crane out of a grocery receipt as we sped down Route 1. The rule was simple. If we saw something interesting, we stopped. No debating, no second-guessing. It didn't matter if it was a scenic overlook or a roadside stand selling lobster rolls. Once, we pulled over for a cardboard sign that just said free stuff in scrawled Sharpie. It turned out to be a box of mismatched socks and a ceramic cat missing an ear. But Abby dug through it like she was panning for gold. She held up a sock with tiny UFOs on it and said, "This one's lucky," before tossing it into the back seat. I laughed so hard I almost fell over. Every ride had its soundtrack, too. Abby was in charge of the music. She'd build these playlists full of random songs that shouldn't have worked together, but somehow did. Folk ballads, 90s pop hits, something in French she couldn't translate, but loved anyway. She'd sing along, drumming on the dashboard, her voice cracking on the high notes. And when the right song came on, she'd stick her arm out the window, fingers slicing the wind like she was carving waves into the air. The best part, though, was the journals. Early on, she started keeping a notebook in the glove box, one of those cheap composition books with the black and white covers. For memories, she said, grinning. She'd write down the weird stuff we saw. The guy selling moonshine out of his trunk, the billboard advertising world's biggest spoon. We stopped. It wasn't. The herd of cows blocking the road for a good 20 minutes while we sat there, windows down, mooing back at them. She'd sketch little doodles in the margins, a lopsided tree, a lighthouse, a surprisingly accurate drawing of me mid-sneeze. Over time, the journals multiplied. By the third year of our wandering hours, there were 6 of them. their pages stuffed with ticket stubs, pressed flowers, Polaroids, and once, a feather we found on a beach that Abby insisted belonged to a gull with a story to tell. Each journal had a name scrawled on the cover in Sharpie. Miles, Driftwood, Horizon. She said they deserved names because they were part of the adventure. I thought it was ridiculous. I also secretly loved it. Then came the fall Abby got sick. We didn't know it at first. She'd always been the type to burn too brightly, so when she started getting tired, we thought it was just her catching up on years of restless energy. But the fatigue turned into pain, the kind that makes you sit down in the middle of the day because you can't stand anymore. And suddenly, the wandering hours stopped. Our world shrank to doctors' offices and waiting rooms. The journal stayed in the glove box, untouched, and the car sat parked in the driveway, leaves piling up around the tires. I tried to bring up the idea of a short ride once. Just a quick loop to the old quarry where we used to sit and watch the sun go down. But Abby shook her head. "I can't," she said, and I didn't push. But one cold November morning, I came downstairs to find her standing by the door, holding the keys. Her face was pale, her hair tucked under one of my old beanies, but her eyes had a spark I hadn't seen in months. "I want to go," she said. We didn't make it far, maybe 10 miles before she asked me to turn around. But we stopped once on a quiet stretch of road near the river, where the sunlight cut through the trees in golden beams. Abby leaned against the car, breathing heavily, and pulled one of the journals from her coat pocket. She handed it to me, a new one I hadn't seen before, with the word stillness written on the cover. "You write this one," she said. "For both of us." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her we'd have plenty of time to fill it together, but she just smiled and shook her head. "For both of us," she repeated. That journal became my anchor after Abby passed. I took it on solo drives, wandering the back roads she'd loved so much, jotting down whatever caught my eye. A hawk circling above a field. A barn painted with a giant sunflower. A diner with a neon sign that buzzed louder than the flies inside. It wasn't the same, of course. It never could be. But writing in that journal felt like carrying her with me. Like she was still there, pointing at the horizon and saying, "Turn left." No, the other left. Now the journals are stacked in my living room, a messy tower of memories, each one spilling over with the life we built together. Sometimes, when the house feels too quiet, I flip through them, letting the scraps of our adventures remind me of what it felt like to be in motion, to never stay in one place too long. And now I'm curious. Do you have something like that, a ritual, a keepsake, a habit that keeps someone close to you, even when they're not around? What's your version of a wandering hour? The day began with a lie, a harmless one, or so I thought at the time. I told my tour group that the gray cat trailing us through Calhoun Square was a ghost. "She's been here for decades," I said, lowering my voice for dramatic effect. "They say she was the beloved pet of a midwife who died during the yellow fever epidemic. She follows me on tours sometimes just to keep an eye on things." The cat, who I'm 99% sure belonged to Mrs. Cleary 3 doors down, blinked at me with bored indifference, as if she knew I was full of it. The group, however, ate it up. Phones came out. Pictures were taken. Some kid in an oversized hoodie whispered, "Whoa, dude," and the mom in the back asked if her spirit would show up on Instagram. I gave my usual cryptic smile and said, "Only if she wants to." It was just one of those little flourishes I toss in to keep things lively. Most ghost stories are laced with a pinch of fiction. It's what makes them stick. But that day, for reasons I still can't explain, the lies I told started coming true. I first noticed it at the old Mercer house, the centerpiece of every Savannah ghost tour. I was doing my usual spiel about Jim Williams and the infamous murder trial, pointing out the windows where people claimed to see shadowy figures. "And if you stand here long enough," I added, "you might catch a faint whiff of cigar smoke. They say it's him, lingering." The wind shifted just as I said it, and I caught it. Tobacco, rich and unmistakable. I stopped mid-sentence, my brain scrambling to explain it. Maybe someone nearby was smoking. Maybe a guest had snuck a puff. But when I looked around, there was no one. Just my group, watching me expectantly. "Did you smell that?" one woman whispered, clutching her husband's arm. He nodded, wide-eyed. "Ah, well," I stammered. "Guess Jim decided to make an appearance today." We moved on, but the unease stayed with me. By the time we reached the Colonial Park Cemetery, I was second-guessing everything. The cemetery is always a crowd pleaser, full of legends about lost graves and restless spirits. I just finished telling them about the duelist buried in an unmarked plot when one of the younger guys in the group, a wiry, jittery type who looked like he'd downed 3 energy drinks before showing up, pointed past me and said, "Who's that?" I turned, expecting to see a tourist wandering off the path, but there was no one there. "What did you see?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "A man," he said, frowning, "dressed kind of old-fashioned. He was right there by the big tree, but now he's gone." That's when I remembered the part of the story I'd added. The bit about the duelist's ghost appearing to challenge anyone who disrespected his grave. I hadn't mentioned it this time, but I'd told it so often, it was practically stitched into the air. "Probably just a shadow," I said quickly, waving it off. But my heart was racing. The final stop on the tour was a narrow alleyway that used to be part of the old city jail. I was walking backward, talking about how prisoners claimed to hear chains rattling at night, when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see someone from the group. No one was there. The alley was empty, save for us, and yet I swore I could still feel the faint pressure of fingers lingering on my coat. "Everything okay?" someone asked. "Fine," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Let's keep moving." When the tour ended, I made a beeline for Leopold's, the best ice cream shop in Savannah, and my personal church on bad days. By the time I'd finished a double scoop of butter pecan, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe the cigar smoke was a coincidence, the hand on my shoulder just a trick of my nerves. I was tired, that's all. Too many late nights and too many tall tales catching up with me. But then I went home. My apartment, a little creaky second-floor place above an antique shop, felt off. You ever notice how some memories feel like they've been playing on a loop in the back of your mind, just waiting for the right song, smell, or random trigger to unspool them? For me, it's the sound of those rusty old shopping cart wheels, like the ones you only find in small-town grocery stores that never bother replacing their carts, because why would they? Every time I hear that squeaky metal grind, I'm 13 again, walking barefoot through the parking lot of Sutter's Market with a bottle of orange soda clinking around in my backpack. Sutter's Market wasn't just a grocery store. It was the place where everything seemed to happen. Birthdays? You picked up the ice cream cake from their tiny freezer aisle. School fundraisers? The cashiers taped your flyers to the checkout lanes. And if you were lucky enough to have a couple of crumpled dollar bills burning a hole in your pocket, it was where you went to buy those sour apple lollipops with caramel in the middle. My best friend at the time, Luke, had this theory that Sutter's Market was actually alive. "Think about it," he said one sweltering afternoon, leaning against his bike like he was about to blow the lid off some huge conspiracy. "No one knows who owns it, right? Like, have you ever seen the Sutter guy? Maybe it's a front for something." "For what?" I'd asked, trying to unwrap one of those impossible red and white mints they kept in jars by the register. "I don't know. A time portal? An alien hub? Something cool." This was classic Luke. Everything had to be part of a bigger mystery. He was the kind of kid who thought every old house had a secret attic, and every weird cloud was probably a spaceship. He kept a notebook full of findings, which mostly consisted of terrible sketches of anomalies we'd spotted around town. A flickering streetlight, a mailbox with peeling paint, or once, a squirrel with a patchy tail. Looking back, I think he just liked the idea that there was more to the world than what we could see. We spent almost every Saturday that summer hanging around the back of Sutter's. The alley behind the store was one of those places grown-ups pretended not to notice. There was a weird, old soda machine back there that looked like it had been dropped from another decade, always stocked with flavors I'd never seen anywhere else. Black cherry cola, pineapple cream, something called Razzle Blue that tasted like liquid candy. 50 cents a can. Luke swore that machine was magical. "They don't stock it," he whispered once, crouched down to inspect the coin slot like it might reveal some grand secret. "It just appears." One day, we decided to test the magic. Luke had read somewhere that soda machines were programmed to reject foreign coins, so naturally, we needed to see what happened if we used one. He dug up some random peso from his dad's coin jar, dropped it into the slot, and waited. The machine made this horrible grinding noise. like it was chewing up the metal, and then spit out a can of something neither of us had ever seen before, Zebra Fizz, with a cartoon zebra wearing sunglasses on the label. We cracked it open and passed it back and forth, both of us convinced we were drinking something impossible. It tasted like licorice and lemon and something we couldn't quite name, but it made us laugh so hard we had to sit down on the pavement. Luke said it was proof. Sutter's is hiding something huge, he said, his voice deadly serious. I bet there's a secret basement under the store. Yeah, I teased, and the cashiers are all in on it. That's why they wore those ugly green aprons. To distract us. He pointed his finger at me like I'd cracked the case wide open. Exactly. The summer went on like that, one ridiculous theory after another, until one night when everything changed. Luke and I had convinced our parents to let us camp in my backyard. But instead of staying put, we snuck out and biked over to Sutter's. The plan was to break into the alley and investigate, which basically meant poking around and daring each other to open random crates. When we got there, the whole store was dark except for the flickering neon, open 24 hours sign buzzing over the door. It felt like a dare. Luke led the way, flashlight in hand, while I kept looking over my shoulder, sure we were about to get caught. When we reached the alley, the soda machine was still there, humming softly in the dark. But something was off. There was a new crate next to it, sealed shut with duct tape and marked with a big red X. Luke's eyes lit up. "This is it," he whispered. "The jackpot." I didn't want to open it. My stomach was doing that thing where it twists itself into knots, but Luke was already peeling back the tape, too excited to notice. Inside the crate was a stack of magazines. Old, dusty ones, like something you'd find in your grandparents' attic. Luke's face fell, but I was weirdly relieved. We started flipping through them anyway, and that's when we found it. Tucked between the pages of some ancient issue of Time magazine was a Polaroid photo, faded but still clear enough to see. It showed two kids standing in front of the soda machine, grinning like they'd just found buried treasure. One of them was wearing a green apron. "Wait," I said, squinting at the picture. "Isn't that the cashier? The one with the freckles?" Luke's jaw dropped. "I knew it. They're part of the conspiracy." I laughed, but the truth was the photo gave me the creeps. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone leave it here? And who was the other kid? We put it back in the crate and biked home in silence, both of us too spooked to talk about it. That was the last summer Luke and I spent together. His family moved to Colorado that fall, and though we wrote letters for a while, eventually we just stopped. I went back to Sutter's a few times on my own, but it never felt the same. The soda machine disappeared one winter, and I heard they tore down the alley to make room for a bigger parking lot. Every now and then I think about that photo, about how the world felt so big and full of mysteries back then. I still catch myself looking for weird soda machines whenever I explore new places, half hoping I'll find another can of Zebra Fizz or something even stranger. It's silly, I know, but I like to believe the magic hasn't disappeared. It's just hiding, waiting for someone to find it again. What about you? Do you have a place or a moment that still feels like it's hiding a secret, even after all these years? Alright, so this story starts in one of the worst places for a socially awkward dude like me to be, a community cooking class. Let me explain how I got there. My sister, bless her overly meddling heart, decided I needed to get out more and gifted me a 6-week course called Cooking for the Clueless. Subtle, right? Anyway, I figured I'd go once, burn a souffle or something, and then politely drop out. It's week 1, and I walk into this tiny kitchen classroom that smells like garlic and fresh bread, actually kind of nice, and I'm hit with a wave of instant regret. The room is full of cheerful strangers in matching aprons, and the instructor, this older woman named Mrs. Potts, yes, like the teapot from Beauty and the Beast, is bustling around like a sitcom grandma. I pick the furthest possible station from the front and pray no one talks to me. Spoiler, someone did. Enter Jules. I didn't know his name yet, obviously, so in my head I just called him Mr. Overconfidence. He was this tall, scruffy guy with tattoos creeping out from under his sleeves and the kind of cocky smile that makes you want to find an exit. He sauntered in 5 minutes late, holding a cup of gas station coffee, and immediately announced, "Sorry I'm late. Couldn't decide between culinary greatness and getting a bagel." The bagel one. Everyone laughed, except me, because all I could think was, oh great, the class clown. And wouldn't you know it, He picked the station right next to mine. Within 20 minutes, Jules had managed to burn a pan of onions, crack an egg directly onto the counter, and nearly set his apron on fire. I mean, I wasn't doing much better. I somehow chopped a zucchini into cubes so uneven they looked like Minecraft blocks, but at least I wasn't narrating my failures like I was on Chopped. Every time something went wrong, Jules would throw his hands up and declare, "Genius at work," like the universe owed him an Emmy for comedic timing. Halfway through the class, we were supposed to pair up to make some fancy chicken dish I can't even pronounce. I'm thinking, please let me partner with literally anyone else. But before I can even blink, Jules turns to me and goes, "All right, you and me, buddy. Let's make this chicken our masterpiece." I stared at him, probably looking like a deer caught in headlights. Sure. Here's the thing, Jules was awful at cooking. Like comically bad. He kept flipping the chicken too early, and when I tried to suggest maybe leaving it alone for a minute, he grinned and said, "Patience is for people with boring lives." At one point, he grabbed a pinch of cayenne pepper and just threw it into the pan, saying, "Gotta add some drama." The chicken ended up so spicy, it made Mrs. Potts cough when she tried it. I left that class more annoyed than I'd been in months. I mean, how could someone be so bad at something and still act like they were the king of the kitchen? I decided that was it. Next week, I'd request a different partner and pray Jules didn't burn the whole place down. But then week 2 came, and somehow, Jules wasn't annoying anymore. Don't get me wrong, he was still chaotic as hell. He showed up late again, this time carrying a 6-pack of energy drinks and a donut, but instead of irritating me, his antics started to feel kind of entertaining. Like, I couldn't help but laugh when he tried to make a souffle without reading the recipe and ended up with something that looked more like scrambled eggs. What really got me, though, was how unshakable he was. No matter how badly he messed up, he just shrugged it off and kept going, like failure wasn't even a concept he acknowledged. After I fumbled a sauce and nearly dumped it all over the stove, I mumbled something about always screwing things up, and Jules just said, "Who cares? That's how you get better, right?" And for some reason, that stuck with me. By week 3, we were an unofficial team. Jules started calling me Chef Serious because, apparently, I looked like I was plotting a heist every time I diced vegetables. In return, I started calling him Chef Chaos, which he wore like a badge of honor. We never won the little Best Dish awards Mrs. Potts handed out. Our food was usually edible at best, and Jules once accidentally flambéed a dessert that wasn't supposed to be flambéed, but we had fun. Like real fun. The kind that makes you forget you're supposed to be socially awkward. Somewhere around week 5, after we successfully sort of made a lasagna without Jules breaking anything, we ended up grabbing burgers at this dive bar near the cooking school. That's when I found out Jules wasn't just a human wrecking ball of energy. He was also genuinely cool. He worked as a freelance photographer, mostly doing concert gigs, and had this insane collection of vintage cameras he rebuilt himself. He told me stories about sneaking backstage at music festivals and accidentally photobombing a famous guitarist. And for the first time in forever, I actually felt relaxed talking to someone new. The last week of the class, we were supposed to cook a full meal for friends and family. Jules didn't invite anyone. He said most of his friends were musicians who lived on ramen and wouldn't appreciate real food. So he ended up helping me prep a fancy salad while chatting with my sister, who, by the way, thinks Jules is a delight. Her words, not mine. She still teases me about how awkward I was around him at first. Now, Jules is one of my closest friends. We still cook together sometimes, though we usually stick to tacos because neither of us has the patience for soufflés. He's the guy I call when I'm stuck on a game design idea, and I'm the guy he calls when he needs a second opinion on whether his latest photo edit is cool or just weird. The funny thing is, I almost wrote him off after that first class. If you told me back then that the loud guy who burned onions and made bad jokes would turn out to be one of the best parts of my life, I would have laughed in your face. But here we are. Sometimes, the people who crash into your life like a hurricane are exactly what you need. Ever had someone completely surprise you like that? It started with a smell. You wouldn't think that's how it begins. But sometimes trouble sneaks up in the most unexpected ways. And this smelled like hot plastic and regret. I was standing in line at the corner market, holding a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, when the guy ahead of me dropped his receipt. Simple enough. I bent down to pick it up because, Hey, people should do that for each other, right? But when I handed it back to him, my eyes caught the words. Shrinkflation. That's what they're calling it now. Fancy word for the same old scam. Less product, same price. But this wasn't just a smaller box of cereal or one less cookie in the pack. This guy had bought a pack of chicken thighs, and the receipt straight up said he'd paid for water weight. Water! I didn't even know they could charge you for something you boiled away. The worst part? He didn't seem to care. Just muttered a thanks and shuffled off like this was normal. And that's when it hit me, maybe it was normal now. Maybe this was just the world we lived in, where they could shrink your snacks, pad your protein, and charge you full price for it while everyone shrugged and went along with their day. Well, not me. Not this time. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was fuming. My roommate, Eddie, was sprawled on the couch, halfway through a bag of chips that looked suspiciously like they were 70% air. "You okay?" he asked, his mouth full. "No," I snapped, tossing the bread and peanut butter onto the counter. You ever think about how much of our food is fake now? Like they're robbing us blind and calling it innovation. Eddie just stared at me. "You're ranting about chips?" "Not just chips. It's everything. They water-chill chicken. They shrink ice cream cartons. They put 10 cookies in a package that used to have 20. And we let them." He blinked at me, then looked at his chips like they'd personally betrayed him. Huh. Never thought about it like that. That was all the encouragement I needed. I spent the next 3 hours online, digging into the rabbit hole of food scams. Did you know there's no law that says companies have to label water-injected meat clearly? Or that they can reduce product size as long as the weight on the package is accurate? It's legal theft, and the law's on their side. By midnight, I had a spreadsheet of examples and a fire in my gut that wouldn't quit. The next day, I walked into the store again. Not for groceries this time, but for answers. I found the manager in aisle 4, restocking the cereal. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you explain why you're selling chicken that's half water, but charging full price?" He looked up confused. I don't set the prices. That's corporate." "Well, who does set them?" "Because someone's making a fortune off the scam, and I want to talk to them." That's how I ended up calling their customer service line, which was a whole other level of frustration. The woman on the phone kept repeating the same script about competitive pricing and industry standards until I finally gave up and slammed the phone down. But I wasn't done. I started filming TikToks. Not the dancing kind, although I did consider a jig to grab attention. Instead, I went full angry consumer, showing people the receipts, the labels, the empty chip bags. "They're stealing from us," I said in one video, holding up a half-full jar of peanut butter. "And they're counting on us not noticing." It blew up. Like millions of views blew up. Suddenly, my inbox was full of messages from people with their own stories. Watered-down soda, chocolate bars with more wrapper than candy, deodorant sticks that were half hollow. It was wild. And then the weirdest thing happened. A local news station reached out. They wanted to interview me about shrinkflation awareness. Me, a nobody with a peanut butter jar and a grudge. I showed up to the interview in my only blazer, trying to look professional. The reporter smiled at me like I was some kind of hero. "So," she said, "what do you hope to accomplish with this campaign?" I froze. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I stammered. "I guess I just want people to care, to notice. Because if enough of us get mad, maybe, just maybe, they'll stop treating us like we're too stupid to see what they're doing." It wasn't the most eloquent answer, but it seemed to resonate. Over the next few weeks, more and more people started posting their own shrinkflation discoveries. It became a whole thing. Do I think we'll actually change anything? Maybe. Maybe not. But I do know this. The next time I see a chicken pack labeled enhanced, I'm not buying it. And if enough people do the same, maybe the suits in charge will finally get the message. For now, though, I'll take the little victories. Like last week, when Eddie walked into the apartment holding a giant bag of chips. "Not today, corporate America," he said, dumping them into a bowl to prove they were actually full. We both laughed, but deep down it felt like a win. Because sometimes that's all you need, a small reminder that you're not crazy, that you're not alone, and that maybe, just maybe, the little guy can fight back. So there I was, standing in my socks in the middle of my driveway, holding a busted can of Diet Dr. Pepper like it was a winning lottery ticket. Elvis, my fat old tabby, was sitting on the hood of my truck, giving me that judgmental look cats specialize in. If someone had driven by just then, they'd probably have called someone to come check on me. But I wasn't crazy. Not really. I was having a moment. Let me back up. That morning started like most mornings. Me dragging myself out of bed after my third snooze button slap, muttering something about quitting caffeine while immediately making a pot of coffee. I had a short haul scheduled, nothing major, just a quick run to Dallas and back. I was actually looking forward to it. Home before sundown, no weird overnight truck stops with broken vending machines or questionable plumbing. Before I left, I grabbed a can of Diet Dr. Pepper from the fridge. It's my ritual, see. That first sip, ice cold, straight out of the can, is the closest thing I have to religion. Some people pray. I crack open a soda. I tossed it in the cup holder, grabbed my hat for luck, because Lord knows I ain't risking a breakdown without it, and headed out. Now, the trip itself was smooth. I didn't hit traffic, the weather held up, and I even found a truck stop with a half-decent breakfast burrito. Everything was going just fine, until I got home. I was unloading my stuff when I saw it. The can of Diet Dr. Pepper, sitting there in the cup holder, unopened. I'd forgotten about it. The sacred first sip, wasted. It was warm by now, of course, and I almost left it there to toss later. But then I thought, no, Cheryl, you don't waste a perfectly good soda. So I grabbed it and started walking toward the house. That's when the universe decided to intervene. 1 second, I'm holding the can. The next, it slips out of my hand, hits the driveway, and explodes like a fizzy grenade. Soda sprays everywhere. On my jeans, my boots, my hair. Even Elvis got a splash, and he let out this offended yowl like I'd done it on purpose. And here's where it gets weird. Instead of getting mad or groaning about how I just ruined my one clean pair of jeans, I started laughing. Not a little chuckle, either. I mean full-on tears streaming down my face laughing. Elvis jumped off the truck and slinked away, clearly done with my nonsense. But I couldn't stop. I stood there, dripping soda, thinking about how stupid it all was. This perfect, ridiculous moment of chaos, brought to you by a lukewarm can of Diet Dr. Pepper. And then, out of nowhere, I felt happy. Not the kind of happy you plaster on your face for a photo, but the real kind. Deep down, it hit me like a freight train. This was life, messy and absurd and sticky, and I was right smack in the middle of it. You know what's funny? I spend so much time trying to make things neat, organized, under control. On the road, it's all about schedules and maps and making sure nothing goes wrong. At home, it's the same, cleaning, fixing, always preparing for something. But standing there, soaked in soda, I realized how much beauty there is in letting go. So I stood there for a while, enjoying the breeze and the smell of soda on hot asphalt. When I finally went inside, I didn't change right away. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, sat on the porch, and let the sun dry me off. Elvis eventually came back, hopping up onto the arm of my chair like he was ready to forgive me. Now, every time I open a can of soda, I think about that moment. About how sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying so dang hard to make everything perfect. Anyway, that's my story. What about you? Have you ever had one of those moments where life surprised you in the middle of something small and silly? Maybe it didn't involve exploding soda, but I bet you've got something. Share it if you feel like it. I could use another laugh. I'm in my parents' garage on a Friday night, hunched over an old laptop that looks like it survived a war. There's an Amazon Basics soldering iron in one hand and a piece of fried circuit board in the other, and I'm muttering things like, "Come on, buddy, don't die on me now," like I'm a doctor on a soap opera. Why? Because I thought it'd be a great idea to buy a broken VR headset off eBay and fix it to save some cash. Spoiler alert, I have no idea what I'm doing. Let me back up. 2 weeks ago, my friend Jason, who always has to one-up everyone, invited me over to try his new VR rig. He booted up this space exploration game where you're flying ships, dodging asteroids, all that cool sci-fi stuff. The second I put that headset on, I was hooked. Like, where has this been my entire life hooked? But when I looked up how much those things cost, yeah, no thanks. That's not happening on my ramen noodles and financial aid budget. So I came up with what I thought was a brilliant plan. Buy a cheap broken one online and fix it. Easy, right? I watched like 3 YouTube tutorials. I felt ready. The guy who sold it to me even wrote in the description, "Probably just needs a new cable." Probably. I I should have taken that word as a red flag, but nope, I dove in like a moron with a soldering iron. Anyway, I'm in the garage trying to Frankenstein this thing back to life when my dad walks in holding a bag of chips. Now, my dad's not a tech guy. He still calls me to ask where the Google is on his phone. So when he sees me with wires everywhere, he just raises an eyebrow and goes, "What's this? Are you building a bomb?" "No, Dad," I say, trying not to sound defensive. "I'm fixing something." He leans in closer, crunching chips obnoxiously loud. "Fixing what?" I explain the whole VR headset situation, expecting him to make some dad joke about how I should get a job if I want nice things. Instead, he looks at the mess I've made, nods, and says, "Need help?" At first, I'm like, "Help? From you?" But then he starts talking about how he used to mess around with car stereos when he was my age, back when wires were color-coded and things weren't as complicated and tiny. I figure, what the heck, 2 heads are better than 1. So now we're both hunched over this busted headset, me trying to sound smart by using words like conductivity and motherboard, while he's just poking things with a screwdriver and going, "This thing looks fried." We spend hours tinkering, swapping parts, watching more YouTube tutorials. It's kind of surreal, honestly. Usually my dad and I don't hang out like this. He's more of a yell at the Bears game on TV kind of guy, while I'm to sit in my room coding until 2 a.m. type. But here we are, bonding over this dumb piece of tech neither of us actually knows how to fix. Finally, at around midnight, I plug the headset in for the 5th time, fully expecting it to do nothing. But then, boom, the lights flicker on, the screen inside the goggles comes to life. It works. It actually works. My dad throws his hands up like he just won the lottery. "Look at that. We're geniuses." I'm grinning so hard my face hurts. For a second, I feel like we've hacked reality itself. Of course, there's a catch. As soon as I put the headset on, I notice the left lens is flickering like it's having a seizure, and there's this weird, high-pitched whine coming from somewhere. But it works enough to play a game, and that's all I care about. I think my dad promised to clean up the mess I don't, and head inside to try it out. Here's where things get wild. I boot up the same space game Jason had, strap on the headset, and get totally immersed. I'm flying through asteroid fields, shooting lasers at enemy ships, living my best sci-fi life. But about 20 minutes in, the headset suddenly shuts off, and I smell something burning. I rip the thing off my face, and sure enough, there's smoke coming out of it. Smoke! My fixed headset just pulled a self-destruct sequence. I panic, unplug everything, and wave my arms around like an idiot trying to fan the smoke alarm. My mom comes downstairs yelling, "What's burning?" And I'm like, nothing. Just, experimenting. The next day, I tell Jason what happened, and he laughs so hard, he almost chokes on his Mountain Dew. "Dude," he says, "you should have just bought a used one that actually works." Yeah, no kidding. Lesson learned. But honestly, I don't even regret it. Sure, the headset ended up in the trash, but that night in the garage with my dad, that was worth way more than any VR game. I guess sometimes the fix isn't about what you're trying to repair. It's about the stuff you accidentally make better along the way. So now I'm curious. Have you ever tried to fix something, only to end up breaking it even more? Or had one of those projects that totally failed but still gave you something you didn't expect? It's a random Tuesday afternoon, and I'm in the parking lot of our local hardware store, having an existential crisis over a bag of mulch. I know, glamorous, right? But stick with me here. This was the day I learned a very important lesson about letting go of control, and it all started because I can't resist a clearance sale. So, backstory. I decided, in my infinite wisdom, that this was the year I'd finally turn my backyard into something other than a patch of weedy chaos. I had big dreams, flowers, maybe a little fountain, one of those Pinterest-worthy garden benches where you pretend to read poetry, but really just scroll on your phone. The problem? I know absolutely nothing about gardening, unless you count keeping my one pothos plant alive through sheer neglect. Anyway, there I was, pushing a cart full of discounted mulch and looking like I had my life together when I saw him. The bird, a crow, specifically. He was hopping around the parking lot with what can only be described as main character energy, cawing dramatically and eyeing me like he knew something I didn't. Now, I've read enough books to know crows are supposed to be mysterious omens or whatever, so naturally I said, "All right, what's your deal?" Out loud like a normal, sane person. The crow just stared at me, then hopped over to my cart and started pecking at the bag of mulch. "Hey, that's mine," I said, which, you guessed it, did absolutely nothing to deter him. I tried shooing him away, but he wasn't having it. He just cawed louder, like he was calling me out for buying mulch on sale instead of paying full price like an adult. And that's when I noticed the little tag on his leg. Turns out, he wasn't just any crow. He was somebody's crow, a pet, or maybe part of some wildlife research project. Either way, he had a tiny metal band around his ankle, which felt oddly official for a bird that was currently trying to fight me over a bag of shredded bark. At this point, I was invested. Forget the mulch. I needed to know who this bird belonged to, and why he was out here terrorizing strangers in a hardware store parking lot. So I whipped out my phone and Googled crow with a leg band Oregon because, again, totally normal behavior. That led me to a local bird rescue organization. And after a couple of phone calls and some very patient explanations from a guy named Ron, I learned that my new feathered friend was named Charlie. Apparently, Charlie had been rehabilitated after an injury, but had decided he liked people too much to go fully wild again. Does he usually hang out at hardware stores? I asked Ron. "Charlie does whatever Charlie wants," Ron said, which felt like the most accurate description of a crow I've ever heard. So there I was, standing in the parking lot with a rogue crow and a cart full of mulch, wondering what to do next. Ron suggested I try luring Charlie into my car with snacks so I could bring him to the rescue center. The only problem? The only snack I had on me was half a granola bar I'd been saving for lunch. "All right, Charlie," I said, breaking off a piece and holding it out like some kind of bird whisper. "You win. Take the granola." To my absolute shock, he did. Not only that, but he hopped onto my cart and let me wheel him over to my car, where he perched on the dashboard like he owned the place. The drive to the rescue center was surreal. Charlie alternated between cawing at passing cars and staring at me like he was silently judging my life choices. By the time we got there, I felt like we'd been through some kind of weird bonding experience, and I was almost sad to hand him over to Ron. "Almost. Thanks for bringing him in," Ron said as he coaxed Charlie into a little outdoor enclosure. Most people would have just ignored him. "Yeah, well," I said, glancing at the bag of mulch still sitting in my car. It felt like the right thing to do. Here's the thing. On the surface, this whole experience was just a random Tuesday misadventure with a very pushy bird. But as I drove home, it hit me how much of my life I spend trying to control things, plans, projects, even my ridiculous backyard makeover. And yet, in the middle of all that, this crow showed up and reminded me that sometimes you just have to roll with the chaos. Did I finish my backyard that year? Absolutely not. But I did start spending more time outside, watching the real main characters, birds, squirrels, the occasional rogue deer, do their thing. And you know what? It felt good to let go of the Pinterest fantasy and just appreciate the messy, unpredictable beauty of it all. So, what about you? Have you ever had a completely random experience that ended up teaching you something important? Or, better yet, do you have a good bird story? I feel like everyone's got at least one. So, picture this. I'm at the hardware store, standing in front of the wall of light bulbs, absolutely paralyzed. Warm light, cool light, daylight, smart bulbs, dimmable bulbs, LED, incandescent. The choices are endless. And all I can think is, did Thomas Edison ever imagine this? I mean, the man just wanted to make the night less dark. And now I'm standing here Googling best light bulbs for cozy vibes like my living room is auditioning for a magazine spread. I finally grab a pack of LEDs labeled soft white. Perfect for relaxing ambience. Because who doesn't want to be relaxed while scrolling Instagram? On my way to the checkout, I notice a couple arguing over paint samples. The woman is holding up two cards, practically the same color, and asking, "But don't you think this one feels more inviting?" The guy looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, muttering, "They're both beige." And that's when it hits me. We live in a world where feelings are baked into everything. Light bulbs, paint colors, even toothpaste. I saw an ad the other day that promised a calming sensory experience while you brush your teeth. When did we get so obsessed with curating our lives? I'm not judging. I'm all for a good vibe, but sometimes I wonder what my grandparents would think. My grandmother had one kind of toothpaste, mint. That was the whole vibe. Later, I was telling my friend Claire about it over drinks. Claire's one of those effortlessly cool people who owns 3 plants she's named after philosophers. She sipped her cocktail, probably something infused with lavender or activated charcoal, and said, "It's not about the stuff, it's about the story. We want to feel like our choices mean something." I nodded like I knew what she meant, but honestly, I was still stuck on the fact that we now live in a world where toothpaste has a storyline. But she wasn't wrong. We do want meaning in the little things, maybe because the big things feel harder to control. I see it all the time with my students. Every year, I have them write an essay on an artifact that represents them: a phone, a hoodie, a concert ticket. One kid last year wrote about her chipped mug from Starbucks, the one she takes everywhere. She called it her travel companion and said it reminded her of all the times she'd been brave enough to leave her comfort zone. A mug. I didn't even know what to say, except, "You're going to make an amazing poet someday." But it stuck with me, this idea that even the smallest things can carry so much weight. I mean, look at me. I still have my dad's old baseball cap, the one he wore every Saturday to mow the lawn. It's faded and fraying, and I'll probably never wear it, but I can't bring myself to throw it out. Every time I see it, I think of him wiping sweat off his brow, grinning at me from behind a pair of crooked sunglasses. It's not just a cap, it's a little slice of him I get to keep. And maybe that's why we've gotten so particular about our choices. It's not just about toothpaste or paint colors or light bulbs. It's about making moments feel intentional, even if they're small. Like my neighbor, who insists on baking her own bread every week. It's cheaper, she says, but I know she just loves the ritual. There's something about kneading dough with your hands, smelling it rise in the oven, that makes life feel, well, real. And yet, for all this intentionality, we've got this paradoxical obsession with efficiency. Everything's faster, smarter, more optimized. I was at a coffee shop last week, and the barista handed me my latte before I'd even finished paying. I said, "Wow, that was quick." She deadpanned. "We aim to please." It felt like a joke, but also not. We've shaved seconds off every process, but where does all that saved time go? Back to scrolling TikTok, I guess. But here's the thing, efficiency doesn't always make life better. Case in point, my grandmother's lasagna recipe. It takes 3 hours to make. You have to layer the noodles just so. Let the sauce simmer until it's thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, and cover it with foil halfway through baking so the cheese doesn't burn. I tried to shortcut it once with store-bought sauce and pre-cooked noodles. It was edible, sure, but it wasn't hers. The world's like that lasagna sometimes. You can take all the shortcuts you want, but you lose a little of the soul in the process. And maybe that's why we cling so tightly to the things that feel personal, even if they're small. A chipped mug, a baseball cap, a light bulb that promises cozy vibes. I'm not saying we need to go back to the old days. I love modern conveniences as much as anyone. I'm not about to start hand-washing my clothes or giving up Wi-Fi. But maybe we don't need to optimize everything. Maybe it's okay to take the long way, to linger over paint samples or bake bread or spend 3 hours on a lasagna. Not because we have to, but because it reminds us what it feels like to choose. So, what's one little thing in your life that feels like more than it is? A thing, a ritual, even a weird quirk that makes your world feel a little more yours? I'd love to hear it. Who knows? Maybe I'll even try your lasagna recipe. It's a Wednesday, late April, and I'm in the kind of mood where even my coffee feels like it's judging me. The pub's got a slow leak in the walk-in cooler that refuses to be found. My shipment of barley got delayed, thanks supply chain chaos. And to top it all off, Buster, my dog, who I love more than most people, is giving me the side eye because I forgot to buy his favorite biscuits. Again. So, I do what any self-respecting pub owner would do when the day feels like a bad sitcom. I bail. Leave a note for Sam to cover the afternoon shift, and decide I'm going to take a drive. No destination in mind, just me, my old Subaru, and the crackling playlist of 90s grunge CDs I keep in the glove box. About 40 minutes out of town, I'm cruising down this stretch of highway that's nothing but rolling hills and the occasional lonely mailbox. The kind of road where you start to lose track of time because every mile looks the same. That's when I see it, a turnoff that I swear wasn't there the last time I came this way. It's marked by this old, hand-painted sign that says, Luna's Emporium, odds, ends, and other possibilities. Naturally, I'm intrigued. What kind of lunatic runs an emporium in the middle of nowhere? Also, what the heck are other possibilities? I figure it's either a sketchy flea market or a front for some weird cult. But either way, I'm curious enough to check it out. The dirt road twists through a small grove of trees and opens up to this clearing where a single building stands. A ramshackle storefront painted in faded shades of teal and mustard, with a crooked wooden sign swinging from chains above the door. The windows are cluttered with random items. A mannequin wearing a feather boa, a rusted tricycle, a single snow globe with what looks like a tiny whale inside. I park the car, get out, and the first thing I notice is the smell. Lavender, cinnamon, and something faintly metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm. The second thing I notice is the cat. It's perched on the porch railing, black as ink, with one white paw and a tail that flicks like it's keeping time to some invisible rhythm. It looks me dead in the eye, lets out this low, raspy meow, and then hops down and struts into the shop like it owns the place. Inside, it's something else. The shelves are crammed with everything you can imagine, and plenty of things you can't. There are jars of marbles, stacks of dusty books with titles and languages I don't recognize, antique clocks that all seem to be ticking at different speeds. Hanging from the ceiling are strings of keys, each one unique, swaying slightly even though there's no breeze. And behind the counter, Luna. Or at least, I assume that's her. She's tall, with silver streak hair piled high on her head and glasses that make her eyes look just a little too big. She's wearing a mismatched sweater and scarf combo, and she's holding what looks like a teacup, except it's shaped like a dragon's head. "Welcome," she says, her voice low and smooth, like she's been expecting me. "Looking for anything specific?" I laugh nervously. "Not really. Just saw the sign and figured I'd stop by." Her eyes flick to the shelf behind me, like she's already figured out exactly why I'm there. Sometimes people don't know what they're looking for until it finds them. At this point, I'm wondering if I've stumbled into a Hallmark movie or an elaborate practical joke, but she's got this calm energy that makes it impossible to leave. So I start wandering. Every shelf feels like it's whispering a story. Old leather-bound journals that beg to be opened, jars of dried herbs with labels like "for new beginnings" and "to remember forgotten things." Then I see it, tucked into the corner of the shop, almost hidden behind a stack of tin lanterns, is a small wooden crate filled with bottles. Not just any bottles, though. Each one is different. Some tall and slender, others short and round, but they all shimmer like they're holding liquid sunlight. "What's in these?" I ask, holding one up. Luna appears beside me like she's been summoned. "Memories," she says matter-of-factly. I snort. "Memories? Like someone's scrapbook collection?" She smiles, but it's not the kind of smile you give to someone who's joking. Not quite. They're moments, snapshots of life, captured and preserved. Some are joyful, some bittersweet. You could take one if you'd like. Now, this is where most people would probably walk away, right? But not me. No. My curiosity is a monster that always wins. "What do you mean?" "Take one." She doesn't explain further, just gestures to the bottles and walks back to the counter, humming a tune I don't recognize. The cat's back too, sitting on the counter now and watching me like it knows something I don't. I pick up a bottle, a small cobalt blue one, and uncork it. Immediately, the room feels warmer. There's a rush of air, like a sigh, and suddenly I'm there. I'm on a beach, the kind you see in postcards, pale sand, turquoise water, and the sky painted in oranges and pinks. There's a bonfire crackling nearby, and I can hear laughter. A girl's voice, my sister's. She's young, maybe 10 or 11, running toward the water with her arms spread wide. I can smell the salt in the air, feel the sun on my skin, hear the waves crashing. It's real. It's not just a memory. It's like I've stepped into it. And then it's gone. I'm back in the shop, the bottle empty in my hand. My heart's racing, and I look at Luna, who's just smiling at me like this is the most normal thing in the world. How did you?" I stammer, completely at a loss. "Not all memories are meant to be forgotten," she says. "Some just need a little help finding their way back." I want to ask more about the bottles, about her, about this whole impossible place. But when I glance down at the bottle again, the label has changed. Now it says, "For the road ahead." I pay for the bottle, if you can call it paying. She waves off my money and asks for a promise instead. Share your stories. That's all I ask. I leave the shop, bottle tucked safely in my bag, and when I look back over my shoulder, the emporium's already fading like mist burning off in the sun. By the time I hit the main road, it's gone completely. I don't know what to make of it, but sometimes when I'm closing up the pub late at night, I take out that bottle and hold it up to the light. It doesn't glow anymore, but it doesn't need to. The memory is still there, as clear and vivid as the day I uncorked it. Have you ever stumbled across a place or a moment that felt like it was meant just for... There's a corner on Burgundy Street where the gas lamps flicker, just a little different, like they're caught in a memory instead of the present. That's where I set up last night. The air had a bite to it. Not quite cold, but sharp enough to make you notice. It was a slow night, even for midweek, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional clap of laughter spilling out of a bar. I just finished my second set when this fellow walked up, wearing the kind of grin that could mean he was either trouble or just trying too hard to pretend he wasn't. He had on a denim jacket with patches sewn haphazard-like, each one telling a story, a faded Grateful Dead skull, the NASA logo, and, of all things, a tiny embroidered saxophone. I noticed that last one, of course, and before I could ask, he said, "You take requests?" His voice was raspy, like someone who'd spent a lifetime shouting over loud music. "Depends," I said, tapping my harmonica against my palm. "What are you thinking?" He pointed at the patches on his jacket. "Play me something that feels like space." I stared at him for a beat, trying to decide if he was joking. But his eyes, dark and restless, told me he was dead serious. So I nodded, closed my eyes, and started blowing a slow, haunting tune, something that climbed and fell like the curve of a crescent moon. It wasn't a song I planned. It just came out of me raw and strange. And wouldn't you know it, he closed his eyes too, swaying like he could feel the stars under his feet. When I finished, he let out a deep breath, like he'd been holding it the whole time. "Damn," he said Logan softly. "That's exactly it. Space. Big and lonely and beautiful." "Appreciate it," I said, pocketing my harp. "You an astronaut or something?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, just a wanderer. Used to hitch rides with bands, sleep under the stage, help them haul amps. Then I got a job on a shrimp boat out of Grand Isle, thought I'd stay there forever. But, life's funny like that. You blink, and suddenly you're back in New Orleans, chasing ghosts." He didn't say what kind of ghosts, and I didn't ask. Some stories come with a keep out sign, and you learn to respect it. Instead, I said, "You got a good ear for music, though. Ever play anything?" He smiled, bittersweet. "Tried guitar once, but my fingers didn't take to it. Guess I wasn't built for strings." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver whistle. "But I carry this around. Found it in a thrift store in Seattle, of all places. Don't know why I bought it, but I couldn't leave it behind. It's busted, don't even play, but it feels right in my hand." I looked at the whistle, tarnished and dented, and felt a strange pang in my chest. "Maybe it's not about playing," I said. "Maybe it's just about holding on to something to..." He nodded like that made all the sense in the world, then dropped the whistle back in his pocket. He said, "I used to think people were like instruments. You spend your life looking for the right hands to hold you, someone who knows how to bring out your song. But maybe some of us are like this whistle, damaged enough that all we can do is remind folks of music they already know." That hit me like a freight train. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say nothing. Sometimes silence is the only answer that fits. After a while, he gave me a nod, the kind that says thanks without saying it. Then he walked off into the shadows, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. I sat there for a long time after he left, just listening to the night. The gas lamps flickered, the quarter breathed its slow, sleepy rhythm. And for the first time in a while, I felt small in a good way. Like I wasn't just playing on a street corner. I was part of something bigger. It's funny, isn't it? How a stranger can show up out of nowhere and leave a mark on you, like a thumb smudge on a window. You might never see them again, but you'll remember the way the light hit their face, the way their words made you feel. What about you? You ever meet someone who felt like a moment in time? Here and gone, but unforgettable all the same? Or maybe it was something they said, something you didn't even know you needed to hear until it stuck with you. Whatever it was, I bet it's still humming inside you like a tune you can't quite shake. Today started with my alarm clock laughing at me. Not the polite chuckle of a bad stand-up comic, but a deep, belly-shaking cackle, like it knew something I didn't. I slapped the snooze button out of habit, and it just said, "Really? You think you've got 5 more minutes in you? Sure, pal, dream big." I sat up, bleary-eyed, and stared at it. "Are you seriously roasting me right now?" "Someone has to," it replied deadpan. "You missed laundry day again." That was fair. My pile of laundry was now tall enough to need a building permit. I sighed and shuffled to the bathroom, where my mirror was already fogged up, except the shower hadn't been on. Written in the condensation were the words, "You're doing fine. Try flossing." "Thanks, I guess." I muttered to the mirror, but it didn't reply. If I'd been smarter, I'd have turned back then, crawled under the covers, and waited for tomorrow to roll around. But no, I decided to go about my day like everything was perfectly normal. Spoiler, it wasn't. Out in the hallway, I bumped into my neighbor, Mr. Finch. He's about 80, sharp as a tack, and generally keeps to himself. Today, he was holding a potted fern that appeared to be giving him stock tips. "You think it's a bull market, too?" "Huh," he said to the plant, nodding thoughtfully. Then he caught me staring. "Don't mind us. Gerald here's got a real nose for futures." "Good to know," I said, edging toward the stairs. "Let me know if Gerald predicts the lotto numbers." He didn't laugh, but the fern rustled like it was deeply amused. Outside, the air smelled like pancakes. No reason for it. It just did. I walked past a hot dog cart that was closed but had a sign taped to it reading, "Back in 10 minutes." Or 10 hours. Who can say? At the corner, a man in a 3-piece suit was teaching a group of pigeons how to waltz. They weren't great at it, but they were trying, and that counts for something. One of them flapped up to my shoulder, perched there like it owned me, and gave me a look that said, "Do you even know where you're going?" I was going to get coffee. I told it because apparently I talk to pigeons now. The pigeon tilted its head, clearly unimpressed, and flew off. At my usual coffee shop, I was greeted by my barista, Carla, who was glowing. Literally, a faint, golden light radiated off her like she'd just been anointed by some coffee god. She slid my latte across the counter and said, "This one's on me." "Why?" I asked. She leaned in close. "Because you'll need it." Then she winked and turned to the next customer, leaving me standing there with a latte that tasted like hope and new beginnings. I walked to the park to collect my thoughts, but the park had other ideas. The squirrels were holding some sort of tiny parade, complete with miniature acorn floats, and the statues were having a conversation. I mean, I didn't hear words, but you could tell. The bronze guy reading a book was gesturing dramatically, while the marble woman on a bench nodded sagely, as if to say, "I see your point, but counterpoint. You're an idiot." I sat down on the grass, trying to ground myself in something solid, when a stray balloon floated by. It wasn't tied to anything, just drifting. The balloon stopped midair, turned if a balloon can turn, and floated toward me. Scrawled on its surface in glittery ink were the words, "Don't overthink it." Easier said than done. I muttered, and the balloon bobbed like it agreed. By the time I headed back home, my brain was buzzing with questions. Was I hallucinating? Was this some bizarre, city-wide prank? Or had the universe just decided to cut loose for a day? Whatever the case, it felt oddly nice. In the lobby, Mr. Finch waved me over. "Gerald says you should invest in green energy stocks," he said, tapping the fern. "Noted," I replied. "And the dryer on the 3rd floor is open if you're finally going to do your laundry." I froze. "How did you?" He just smiled. "Gerald knows things." Back in my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter and flopped onto the couch. Basil, my cat, climbed onto my chest, kneading my shirt like he was working through his own existential crisis. "So, what do you think?" I asked him. He didn't answer. At least something was still normal. But then, as I reached for the remote, he let out a soft, deliberate purr that sounded suspiciously like, "You'll figure it out." So here's my question, Reddit. If you woke up and the world had decided to be just a little bit weirder, plants giving stock advice, balloons with life mottos, glowing baristas, how would you spend the day? Would you play along? Try to fix it? Or just grab a latte and let it ride? I don't remember the exact moment I decided to throw my life into a food truck. It wasn't some grand epiphany, or movie montage. It was more like an itch that got worse every day until I finally scratched it. I was 44 at the time, stuck in the twilight zone of midlife. Divorced, unemployed, and surviving off a dwindling savings account and an embarrassing amount of frozen pizza. The day I bought the truck was sunny, which in Seattle feels like a sign from the universe. Or at least that's what I told myself while handing over the cash to a guy named Cliff who called the truck Betty and patted her like a prize cow. Betty was a mess. The kind of mess that makes you question every decision that brought you to this point. The inside smelled like burnt onions and regret. The fryers hadn't been cleaned in what I can only describe as years. The engine rattled like an old smoker hacking up a lung. But she was mine, a beaten-up little dream on wheels. I named her the Grit Grill. I figured if I was going to pour my last ounce of energy into a food truck, it should sound tough, scrappy, and unapologetic. Like me, I guess. The concept? Comfort food with a wild streak. Think loaded potato wedges drenched in Korean barbecue sauce or apple pie milkshakes with a shot of whiskey. Nothing healthy, nothing subtle. If you wanted kale, you'd have to go somewhere else. My first day out was chaos. I parked near Capitol Hill, right where the artsy types roam in search of overpriced coffee and inspiration. I had a simple menu: burgers, fries, and my specialty, dirty dogs, which were basically hot dogs buried under mountains of toppings. Within an hour, I was out of napkins, one fryer stopped working, and a guy with a man bun asked if I offered gluten-free buns. I didn't, and he gave me a look like I'd personally offended his ancestors. But hey, I sold out a dirty dog, so I called it a win. The thing about running a food truck is you become part chef, part entertainer, and part therapist. People don't just come for the food. They come for the experience. I've had customers cry while eating my breakup fries, which are just regular fries loaded with pulled pork, jalapenos, and spicy aioli. One woman called them the emotional support fries I didn't know I needed. She tipped me $20 and left with mascara streaks on her cheeks. Then there are the regulars. Like Eddie, a construction worker who swears my burgers are the only reason he doesn't skip lunch. Or Sophia, a high school senior who always orders the mac and cheeseburger and talks to me about her college essays while I grill. And then there's Earl, a grumpy old guy who only orders coffee, black, no sugar, and tells me stories about the good old days while side-eyeing my tattoo like it's a personal insult. Not every day is sunshine and loaded fries. Some days it feels like Betty's trying to kill me, like the time the grill caught fire mid-lunch rush. I didn't panic. Well, not outwardly. I grabbed the fire extinguisher, sprayed the hell out of it, and then apologized to a line of very confused customers while covered in foam. One guy asked if his burger was still coming. I gave him a free soda and told him to lower his expectations. And then there's the weather. Seattle rain isn't romantic when you're trying to keep burgers dry while your chalkboard menu dissolves into illegible streaks. One particularly bad day, I tried taping plastic wrap over the menu, which worked great until the wind picked up and turned the whole thing into a flapping mess. A little girl pointed at it and said, "Mommy, it looks like it's dancing." That was the closest I came to quitting. But I didn't, because for every disaster, there's a moment that makes it worth it. Like the time a guy proposed in front of my truck. He brought his girlfriend there on their first date and said my fries were part of their love story. He got down on one knee, ring in hand, while she clutched a basket of gritty tots and cried happy tears. She said, "Yes, by the way, the food itself? It's a constant experiment. Some ideas flop, like the fried pickle sundae, which I thought was genius until people started gagging after one bite. But then there are the unexpected hits like Chuo cheesecake bites, which became so popular I had to start making double batches. I keep a notebook of every recipe, even the disasters. I call it my grimoire of grease. Customers love hearing about the failures as much as the successes. There's something comforting about knowing even the chef screws up. At night, after the last order's served and Betty's parked, I sit on the curb with a cheap beer, staring at the city lights. It's not glamorous, but it's real. I think about how far I've come, from a guy drowning in frozen pizza to someone who can make a living slinging loaded fries and whiskey shakes. And for the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. A little beat up, a little messy, but full of grit. Just like Betty. Just like me. I don't know if you've ever been to a library at night, like when the doors are locked and the only light comes from the street lamps spilling in through the tall windows, but it's got this kind of magic to it. The air feels thicker, quieter, like you've slipped into a space that isn't entirely yours. That's what I remember most about the summer I turned 12. The nights my older cousin Jesse and I used to sneak into the old public library on Main Street. It wasn't some grand, historic thing with columns and a marble staircase. Nah, this library was built in the 60s and looked like a concrete shoebox that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. But inside, it smelled like old books and worn carpet, and it had these little nooks where the shelves formed dead ends, places where you could sit on the floor and feel like you were completely hidden from the world. Jesse was 16 that summer, tall and lanky with a head full of curls that never stayed flat no matter how much gel he used. He'd just gotten his driver's license, and his parents let him take their ancient station wagon, a sputtering, rust-covered beast that smelled faintly of gasoline, anywhere he wanted as long as he was home by midnight. Jesse didn't use that freedom for anything normal, like cruising to the mall or hitting up a drive-in. No, he had one mission that summer, to uncover what he called the library secrets. It started as a joke. One of the librarians, Mrs. Kendall, had told us in passing that the library's basement was off-limits because it was unsafe. To a normal person, that just meant the basement was full of asbestos or crumbling floorboards. To Jesse, it meant treasure, or ghosts, or knowing him both. The truth, he declared one night while pulling into the library's empty parking lot, is always hidden where they tell you not to go. He turned off the engine, and we sat in the dark for a moment, staring at the lifeless building like it might open its mouth and invite us in. We'd been casing the place for weeks, learning how to time it just right so we could slip in before they locked up for the night. The library had these old windows that didn't latch properly, and Jesse had figured out how to jimmy one open with a flathead screwdriver. The first time he did it, I thought for sure we'd set off some alarm or get caught by a security guard, but there was nothing. Just silence and the soft hum of fluorescent lights that hadn't been turned off yet. We'd always bring flashlights, not because it was pitch black. The emergency lights cast this eerie glow down the aisles, but because it felt more official, like explorers in a lost city. Jesse carried a backpack with snacks and a notebook where he wrote down every weird thing we found. Book titles that seemed too strange to be real. A Beginner's Guide to Werewolf Law, Topiary Shapes for the Modern Warrior, odd messages scrawled in the margins of old paperbacks, and once, a single red mitten tucked between two encyclopedias. Clues, he said, though I wasn't sure what they were supposed to lead to. The basement door was locked, of course. Jesse spent hours trying to pick it with a bobby pin he stole from his sister, but it didn't budge. They knew someone like me would come along, he muttered, pacing the aisle nearest the door. That's why it's locked so tight. They're hiding something big. What, like a curse dictionary? I teased, but part of me wanted to believe him. Then, one night we found the map. It was tucked into the back of an ancient book called The History of Unnamed Places, wedged so far into the shelf that Jesse nearly dislocated his shoulder trying to pull it out. The map wasn't labeled, but it looked old, faded lines and squiggly marks in ink that had bled over time. Jesse laid it flat on the floor, his flashlight beam flickering over the brittle paper. "This," he whispered, "is it. Proof." Proof of what? He jabbed a finger at one of the marks, a tiny X drawn in a corner that looked vaguely like our library's layout. "There's something here, under the basement." It sounded ridiculous, but Jesse had that look in his eye, the one that meant he wasn't going to let this go. Over the next few weeks, he became obsessed, spending every free moment poring over the map and sketching out plans to break through. He even brought a crowbar one night, which I immediately vetoed. "You can't just smash through the floor," I hissed, but he grinned like he'd already considered that and had a backup plan. Then, one of the last nights before school started, we finally got our chance. A freak storm had knocked out power to half the town, including the library, and for some reason, the basement door had been left unlocked. Jesse pushed it open, flashlight in hand, and we crept down the stairs into the thick, stale air below. The basement wasn't what I expected. No piles of books or forgotten relics. Just rows of metal shelves covered in dusty boxes, the kind labeled with things like tax records 1982 and old receipts. Jesse was undeterred. He prowled the space like a bloodhound, muttering under his breath. And then he stopped. In the far corner of the room, tucked behind a stack of broken chairs, was a trapdoor. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to grab Jesse and drag him back upstairs. But he was already pulling the door open, revealing a rickety wooden ladder leading down into darkness. "Come on," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. The space below wasn't big. Just a dirt floor and stone walls, the kind that made you feel like you'd wandered into a medieval dungeon. But there, in the middle of the room, was the real mystery, a single, rusted lockbox. Jesse knelt beside it, fumbling with the latch until it creaked open. Inside was nothing, just a pile of old receipts and a single black and white photo of a woman standing in front of the library, holding a book to her chest. Jesse stared at it for a long time, like he couldn't quite believe that this was all there was. Finally, he laughed, shaking his head. "They got us," he said. "Whoever they are." We left the photo behind, climbed back up the ladder, and closed the trapdoor. But I've always wondered about that woman, who she was, why the box was hidden, and whether we'd stumbled onto something bigger than we could understand. Every time I pass a library now, I think about that summer, about Jesse, the map, and how even the smallest places can feel endless when you're young enough to believe they're hiding something. So, what about you? Do you have a place or moment that still feels like it's holding a secret? Buckle up, because this one's going to sound like I hit my head or accidentally inhaled some weird lab chemicals. I didn't, I swear. So, I wake up yesterday morning, same as always, alarm blaring, sunlight doing that annoying thing where it finds the one gap in my curtains, and me flopping around like a dying seal. Nothing new, right? Wrong. Because when I dragged myself into the kitchen, I noticed something weird, like off. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The toaster looked the same. My fridge hummed away, like usual. But the air? The air felt chatty. I didn't even realize what was happening until I reached for my favorite mug. The second my fingers wrapped around it, this gravelly little voice went, "Oh, you again." I froze. "What?" "Don't act surprised," the mug grumbled. "You know it's always me. I'm your favorite, right? You think the other mugs don't notice? Do you even realize how awkward it gets in the cabinet? They hate me now." I dropped it, not on purpose, but out of sheer what the hell panic. It clattered into the sink, and I was like, nope. Am I still asleep? My coffee machine answered that one. "Oh, sweetie, if you were dreaming, I'd at least be a French press. Wake up, get it together, and stop using cheap beans." Now, I know myself. I panic over everything. Parking tickets, overdue library books, whether stingrays feel emotions. But for some reason, after about 5 minutes of pacing around my tiny kitchen, I just accepted it. Like, all right, my appliances talk now. That's a thing. Cool. Except it wasn't just the appliances. I walked outside to sit on the stoop and collect my thoughts, and that's when I noticed the real madness. The breeze itself whispered to me, "Rough morning, huh?" I squinted up at the sky. Is this normal? Or am I losing it? The tree next to me chimed in, its branches rustling smugly. Define normal. Most humans don't notice us. They're too busy stepping on ants or staring at their glowing rectangles. Okay, so now nature was judging me? I laughed nervously and muttered, "Sure, why not?" before wandering down to the park to clear my head. Spoiler alert, the park had opinions. The grass grumbled about how often it gets trampled. The ducks in the pond gossiped like high schoolers. "Did you see Kevin yesterday? Couldn't even fly straight." "Oh, Kevin's always been a mess." And the park bench I plopped onto wheezed. Finally, someone lightweight. "Do you know how many big-butted tourists sat on me this week?" I couldn't stop giggling at that one. "I'm losing it," I said out loud. "No, you're not," the bench replied. "You're just finally paying attention." But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened when I walked to the pier. I always go there when I need to think. There's something calming about staring at the waves, watching the boats bobbing along. Except this time, when I got close, I realized the waves weren't just crashing. They were talking. "Hey, landlubber," one shouted as it rolled toward me. Another chimed in, "Yeah, you with the sandals. You think you're deep? Try being literally bottomless." I blinked. "You got to be kidding me." The waves laughed. "She's slow, huh? Poor kid. Oh, give her a break. A nearby seagull squawked. Humans don't get it. Too much noise in their heads. I sat down on the edge of the pier, staring at the water like it had grown arms. So, is everything alive? Or just noisy? Both, the waves answered. We've always been alive. You just don't listen most days. For the next hour, I sat there completely mesmerized while the ocean told me its secrets. Did you know it remembers every shipwreck? Every storm? Every little thing that falls into it, from coins to entire cities? It even remembers laughter. That's what it loves the most, apparently. Kids splashing in it, families building sandcastles. You humans think you're the messy ones, it said. But we're messy, eh? Have you seen the Mariana Trench? It's a hoarder's paradise down there. Eventually, a crab sidled up next to me, snapping its claws like it was auditioning for a stand-up routine. Don't let the waves fool you, it said. They're big softies. Me? I'm tough. You want answers? Talk to me. Okay, I said, humoring it. Why is this happening to me? The crab shrugged. Beats me. Maybe the universe got bored. Maybe you needed a wake-up call. Or maybe... It paused dramatically, wiggling its antennae. You're the chosen one. I snorted. You right? Chosen for what? Having a toaster with a god complex? Exactly, the crab deadpanned. When I finally made it back home, everything felt different. Not in a bad way, though. Just alive. My apartment welcomed me like an old friend. The fridge muttered something about leftovers. My bed sighed with relief when I flopped onto it. Even my ceiling fan, which I always thought was just a fan, murmured, I've been watching over you for years, you know. You're a ceiling fan, I said. Exactly, it replied, as if that explained everything. So now, here I am, living this weirdly sentient life. Honestly, I kind of love it. It's like having an endless group chat, except it's your stuff and the occasional bird screaming insults at you. I don't know if this is permanent, but I'm leaning into it. Here's my question for you. If this happened to you, would you want it to stop? Or would you just roll with it and see where it goes? Personally, I'm all in. Who needs silence when you can have a crab with a sense of humor and a bed that has your back? Literally? I never planned to break into someone's garage. That probably sounds like a lie, but hear me out. I'm not some sketchy dude. I'm just the idiot who didn't pay attention when his friend said, meet me at the blue house on Maple. Not green, blue. It was supposed to be a quick hangout with Will, my best friend since 7th grade, when we bonded over getting detention for making armpit noises during math class. He'd just moved into this new neighborhood, and I hadn't seen him in weeks. The direction seemed straightforward enough. Park near the big oak tree. Go to the side door by the garage. Easy, right? Except, apparently, there are 2 houses on Maple with oak trees out front, and my brain was like, green? Blue? Same difference. I pulled up, grabbed the 6-pack I'd brought to bribe him into helping me fix my lawnmower, and strolled up the driveway. The garage door was slightly open, like someone had left it ajar while running inside to grab something. Perfect. I knocked, but no one answered. Well, I called out, sticking my head under the door. All I saw was a cluttered workbench and a pair of muddy boots. Now, a smarter person might have thought, maybe I've got the wrong place. But I doubled down. I crouched and slid under the half-open door like a spy sneaking into a top-secret facility. Well, I shouted again, louder this time. Still nothing. I decided to wait. Leaned against the workbench, idly examining a rusty pair of pliers while wondering why Will hadn't cleaned up yet. He was usually meticulous, the kind of guy who alphabetized the spice rack and owned a label maker. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not the casual, oh, hey, someone's home kind of footsteps, but the heavy, deliberate kind, like someone trying to sneak up on a raccoon in their trash. My first thought was Will trying to mess with me. My second thought, about 2 seconds later, was this is not Will. A man appeared in the doorway, older than Will by at least 20 years, wearing a ratty tank top and a look that could curdle milk. What the hell are you doing in my garage? Time froze. I held up the 6-pack like a medieval knight offering a peace treaty. A beer? He stared at me like I'd just proposed marriage to his dog. Get out, he growled. Right? Of course. I babbled, edging toward the door. Funny story. I thought this was my friend's place. Honest mistake. Really nice garage, by the way. Love what you've done with the tools. He didn't respond, just crossed his arms and watched as I ducked under the door again, this time with all the dignity of a cat caught falling off a windowsill. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a moment, heart pounding like I'd just outrun a bear. That's when I noticed the actual blue house, 2 doors down, with Will standing on the porch, waving like an idiot. "Dude," he called as I approached, still clutching the six-pack like a lifeline. "What took you so long?" "Oh, I said, trying to sound casual, just accidentally committing a felony." I told him the whole story, expecting him to laugh so hard he'd fall over. Instead, he frowned. "Wait, was it the guy with the tank top?" "Yeah." "Why?" Will winced. "That's Mr. Kowalski. He's, not exactly known for being friendly." "Yeah, no kidding," I said, shaking my head. Later, we were sitting on Will's porch, 2 beers deep, when we saw Kowalski walk past with his dog, a tiny, yappy thing wearing a sweater. The man scowled at me, but didn't say a word. Will leaned over, smirking. "You should have complimented his dog." I groaned. "Next time, remind me to triple-check your directions before I end up on a neighborhood watch list." So yeah, lesson learned. When your friend says blue, don't assume green is close enough. And maybe, just maybe, don't crawl into garages uninvited. Turns out, some people don't appreciate the gesture, even if you bring beer. I'll never forget the first time I met Benny, even though met might be a stretch. He wasn't a person. Benny was a pelican. And not just any pelican, but a grumpy, slightly overweight one with an attitude that screamed retired sea captain. I found him on a foggy morning down by the jetty, tangled up in a mess of fishing line and what looked like the remains of someone's poorly planned picnic. "All right, big guy," I said, crouching down as he side-eyed me like I was the villain in his life story. "Let's not make this weird." Benny, of course, made it weird. He squawked, flapped his wings like he was auditioning for a nature documentary, and smacked me with his beak. Twice. But I could see he was scared and probably in pain. So I took a deep breath, dodged another attempted smack, and got to work untangling him. I talked the whole time, because that's just what I do. "You're lucky I'm here, and not some rookie who doesn't know their way around a bird beak," I said, carefully snipping the line wrapped around his leg. Benny, if you just stopped thrashing, this would go a lot faster." By the time I got him free, we had a kind of understanding. He stopped trying to attack me, and I stopped calling him names like Captain Grumpy Pants. He gave me this long, dramatic look before hopping a few steps away and taking off into the fog. I didn't think I'd see him again. I mean, pelicans don't usually hang out with people, right? Wrong. The next morning, I'm sitting on the beach, sipping the worst coffee I've ever made because I forgot to clean my French press, and who waddles up like he owns the place? Benny. I swear he recognized me. He stood there for a second just staring and then flopped down about 10 feet away like, "Yeah, I'm here. Deal with it." This became a thing. Every morning for a week, Benny showed up. Sometimes he'd bring a little souvenir like a piece of seaweed or a random shell, which I decided was his way of saying thanks. Other times, he'd just sit there, watching the waves like we were 2 old friends silently judging the world together. I started bringing him snacks. Not fish, because I didn't want him to get the wrong idea, but little bits of chopped up lettuce. He liked lettuce. Who knew? The turning point came on the 7th day, which was a Friday. I was sitting on my usual rock, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed Benny acting off. He kept pacing back and forth, flapping his wings like he was trying to get my attention. "What's up, dude?" I asked, standing up to see what was going on. That's when I saw the dolphin. It was a little one, maybe a calf, stuck in a shallow tide pool about 50 yards away. Its gray skin looked dry, and it was making these soft, high-pitched noises that broke my heart. Benny squawked at me, then at the dolphin like he was saying, "Well, do something." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my gear from the truck. Thankfully, I always have rescue supplies with me, and ran over to the tide pool. The dolphin wasn't injured, just stranded, probably from the rising tide the night before. It took some careful maneuvering and a whole lot of whispering. "All right, baby, we're going to get you out of here. Don't panic, okay?" Benny brought the backup squad. But eventually, I guided it back into the open water. The moment it swam away, I turned to thank Benny, but he was already waddling back to his usual spot like, "Yeah, you're welcome." I laughed so hard I almost fell into the tide pool. The next day, Benny didn't show up, or the day after that. I like to think he figured his job was done, that he'd brought me a challenge and I'd passed. Or maybe he just got bored of lettuce. Either way, I'll always remember that week as the time I accidentally befriended a pelican and helped a dolphin because of it. It was the kind of wild, unplanned experience that makes life feel a little magical, like the ocean was saying, "Hey, thanks for looking out for us." Have you ever had a moment where an animal seemed to know exactly what you needed, or maybe even saved you in some weird way? Because I swear Benny was more than just a bird. He was a partner in crime. Or rescue, I guess. Let me tell you about a date that wasn't supposed to be a date, but ended up being the closest thing I've ever felt to magic. Or chaos. Maybe both. It started with a flat tire. Classic, right? I just finished a stakeout at a diner off I-285, tailing this guy who swore to his wife he wasn't cheating, spoiler. He was, but only with late-night poker games. Anyway, it's pouring rain, and my car decides to die in the most dramatic way possible, right there in the parking lot. Enter Eli. He's this guy sitting at the counter inside, halfway through a plate of waffles. I only noticed him because he was laughing at something on his phone, like a real head-thrown-back kind of laugh. I don't know why, but it stuck out. I was on the phone with AAA, trying not to lose my temper, when Eli walked over and knocked on my car window. I rolled it down just enough to hear him. "You need help? Or are you just here to drown with the rest of us?" he said, grinning like he'd been waiting his whole life to say something that dumb. "I'm fine," I said, even though I wasn't. "Sure you are," he said, and before I could argue, he jogged back inside and came out with an umbrella. He handed it to me like it was no big deal. "Hold this. I'll take a look." Turns out he was a mechanic, or, as he put it, a car therapist. He jacked up the car, popped the spare on in record time, and gave me a quick rundown of what was wrong. "Your alignment's shot, and this spare? It's got about 10 miles in it tops." "Great," I said. "Guess I'll limp it home and hope for the best." He shook his head. "Nah, follow me. My shop's just a few blocks away. I'll patch the tire, and you'll be good to go." Now, under normal circumstances, I'd never follow a random guy anywhere. But something about Eli felt safe, like he wasn't trying to pull anything. So I followed him. His shop turned out to be this tiny garage tucked behind a gas station. It smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, and there were mismatched Christmas lights strung up along the walls. "Ignore the mess," he said, leading me inside. "My assistant quit last week, and I haven't exactly been thriving." I sat on a beat-up couch while he worked, flipping through a magazine from 2017. Every now and then, he'd glance up and say something random like, "You ever notice how cats never look embarrassed, even when they screw up?" Or, "What's the worst case you've ever had as a PI?" That caught me off guard. "How do you know I'm a PI?" He pointed to my car outside. "You've got binoculars on the dash and a file folder labeled Street Point Claire, suspect. Either you're a PI or you're really bad at spying on your ex." I laughed. Fair enough. We talked while he worked, and I found myself telling him stories I don't usually share. Like the time I spent 3 days pretending to be a dog walker to catch a guy who was embezzling from his boss, or how I keep a deck of cards with me because shuffling helps me think. He didn't laugh at the weird stuff. If anything, he seemed fascinated. By the time he finished patching the tire, it was close to midnight. I reached for my wallet, but he shook his head. "Call it even," he said. "Even for what?" "For letting me distract you for a couple hours. My dog usually does the heavy lifting, but she's at my sister's this week." That's when I noticed the picture on his desk. A scruffy mutt with a crooked ear. "What's her name?" "Pickles," he said like it was the most natural thing in the world. I was about to leave when he held up a greasy deck of playing cards. "You want to play a round before you go?" "Of what?" "Doesn't matter. Dealer's choice." I couldn't help but smile. "You sure you're not just stalling so I'll keep you company?" "Maybe. Is it working?" It was. We ended up sitting on the couch, playing war like a couple of kids at summer camp. He was terrible at it. Kept losing his kings to my aces, but he didn't seem to care. At one point, he said, "This is the best date I've been on in a while." I raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a date." "It could be," he said, grinning, "if you wanted it to be." And just like that, I realized I did. Not because he was smooth or charming, but because he was kind. Because he'd seen me, rain-soaked, frustrated, and definitely not at my best, and decided I was worth sticking around for. We exchanged numbers before I left, and as I drove home, I kept thinking about the Christmas lights in his shop. The way he'd said pickles like it was a secret password, and how he didn't flinch when I told him I once caught a guy stealing lawn flamingos. We've been together for 8 months now. Pickles loves me, Eli's still bad at cards, and my car hasn't broken down since. But sometimes when it rains, I find myself hoping for a flat tire, just to remind me how it all started. So, have you ever had something go completely wrong, only for it to lead you exactly where you were supposed to be? Because I never believed in that kind of thing, until Eli. It's weird how some memories don't feel like they're yours anymore. Like you live them, sure, but they belong to someone you used to be. That's how I feel about the summer I spent delivering newspapers on my bike. I was 14, and let me tell you, no one looks cool with a canvas satchel full of rolled-up newsprint slapping against their hip. Not even me. And I had a handlebar sticker that said "Born to Ride" in bold black letters. The route was simple. 20 blocks of sleepy houses with cracked driveways and overgrown hedges. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every morning at 5 a.m., I'd drag myself out of bed, throw on the same ratty sneakers, and pedal out into the kind of quiet that only exists when the world hasn't quite woken up yet. There's a hush at that hour, like the earth itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of day it's going to be. There was this one house on the corner of Maple and 3rd, big, spooky, always dark. It had one of those wrought iron fences that looked like it was designed to keep people out, not in. Most of the houses on my route had neat little boxes attached to the front door where I could toss the paper and move on. Not this one. This place didn't even have a porch, just a long, narrow driveway that stretched back into the shadows. The mailbox was clear at the end, right by the garage. I hated delivering to that house. It wasn't just creepy. It felt wrong, like it was watching me. I'd pedal up, toss the paper as far as I could, and tear out of there like something was about to grab my back tire. Some days, I'd swear I heard the faintest sound of footsteps crunching gravel behind me. But whenever I looked back, there was nothing. Just that stupid, empty driveway disappearing into the dark. One morning, the paper slipped out of my hand mid-throw and landed square in the middle of the driveway. Great. I thought about leaving it there. I mean, technically it was on the property, right? But then I imagined the customer calling the newspaper office to complain and my boss chewing me out. So I sighed, hopped off my bike, and crept up the driveway to retrieve it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a statue. It was standing at the far edge of the driveway, near the garage, a figure, tall and lean, with long arms hanging by its sides. Its head was tilted, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing there. I froze, clutching the stupid newspaper in one hand and my bike handles in the other. My brain was screaming at me to move, but my legs were jelly. And then it moved, not much, just a slight shift, like it was leaning forward to get a better look at me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Finally, my body caught up with my brain, and I bolted, chucking the paper as I ran. I didn't even look back to see if it followed me. I just pedaled as fast as I could until I was blocks away, my breath ragged and my chest on fire. When I told my friends about it later, they laughed it off. It was probably just a shadow, one of them said, or some guy taking out the trash. But I knew it wasn't that. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't a shadow, and it definitely wasn't some guy. Shadows don't lean. After that, I started timing my route, so I'd hit that house right as the sun was coming up. Daylight made it feel less scary, though I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me every time I pulled up to that mailbox. One morning a few weeks later, I worked up the nerve to knock on the door. I didn't really have a plan. I just wanted to see who lived there, to prove to myself that it was just some harmless old couple who liked to sleep in. But no one answered. The house stayed dark and silent, like always. I waited for what felt like forever before giving up and heading back to my bike. As I was leaving, I noticed something on the ground near the fence. A Polaroid, weathered and crinkled at the edges. I picked it up and turned it over. It showed the house, but not as it was now. In the photo, the front yard was neatly trimmed, the paint wasn't peeling, and there were kids playing in the driveway. A boy and a girl, both laughing, their faces turned toward the camera. Something about it gave me chills. I didn't keep the photo. I tucked it into the mailbox, figuring it must have belonged to the people who lived there. But when I came back the next day, it was gone, and so was the paper I delivered. For the first time, it felt like someone had actually read it. I never did find out who lived in that house. By the end of summer, I'd saved up enough to quit the paper route and buy a better bike. But every so often, when I'm riding through town, I'll take a detour past Maple and 3rd just to see if anything's changed. The house is still there, of course, just as dark and creepy as ever. But now, there's a small wooden box mounted to the fence, like a library drop box, except instead of books, it's filled with Polaroids. I stopped to look once. Most of the photos were of normal stuff: trees, sunsets, old cars. But in the very back, I found one that sent a shiver down my spine. The same boy and girl from the photo I'd found, standing in front of the house. Only now their faces weren't laughing. They weren't smiling at all. I left it there and rode home without looking back. What about you? Do you have a place from your past that still gives you goosebumps, even when you know you should be over it? I was halfway through my set on the strip when I saw her, a little girl with pigtails and one sock rolled down, clutching a ragged stuffed bunny like it was the most precious thing in the world. Her parents were deep in their phones, and she was watching me like I just pulled the moon out of my pocket. You live for those moments as a magician, right? The instant someone actually believes. So I decided to give her something special. I grabbed a quarter from my pocket, flipped it high in the air, and poof, made it disappear right before it landed. She gasped, and I swear, it was like I'd just unlocked a treasure chest full of stars for her. Then I pulled the quarter out from behind her bunny's ear, handed it to her, and said, "You better keep an eye on your rabbit. He's got a knack for hiding things." That's when I saw it. Not the quarter, not the kid, but the bunny itself. Its fur was all patchy, and one of its ears was hanging on by a thread, but its face, that goofy little embroidered smile, hit me like a sucker punch. It wasn't just any bunny. It was her, Floppy Bunny. I used to have one just like it. Same tan fur, same uneven button eyes, same permanently tilted smile. My Floppy Bunny went everywhere with me when I was a kid, slept next to me, sat at the dinner table, rode shotgun on family road trips. That thing wasn't just a toy. It was a sidekick, a co-conspirator, a confidant. And just seeing that little girl clutch hers brought it all back. Suddenly, I was 7 years old, sitting on the green shag carpet in our tiny apartment in Reno. It was the summer my dad left. Mom was working double shifts at the diner, and I didn't understand why things felt so quiet all the time. But Floppy Bunny? She got it. I'd sit cross-legged on the floor, telling her all the stuff I couldn't say out loud. How I missed the way my dad used to whistle when he made pancakes. How I hated the new kid at school who called me Rabbit Boy for carrying her around. And she just sat there, listening, her head flopping to one side like she was nodding in sympathy. I can still feel her in my hands, soft and warm, like a tiny piece of safety I could carry around with me. Whenever things got too loud, like when Mom and Dad would argue on the phone, I'd press her face against mine and breathe in that faint smell of detergent and crayons. It was the closest thing I had to magic back then, the way she could make the scary stuff feel small. But then I got older, and Floppy Bunny didn't make the cut. She got boxed up with old action figures and soccer trophies when we moved to Vegas. At some point, the box disappeared, probably during one of Mom's decluttering kicks. I didn't think about her for years. Until now. I couldn't stop staring at the little girl's bunny, feeling this weird ache in my chest, like I'd lost something I didn't even know I missed. The rest of my set was a blur. Cards vanished, coins reappeared, people clapped, but I was somewhere else entirely. That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done in forever. I called my mom. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember what happened to Floppy Bunny?" There was a pause, then a laugh. "That old thing? I think I gave her to Goodwill ages ago." "Why?" "No reason." I lied. But there was a reason. The next morning, I went to every thrift store in the city, hunting for some version of her. I knew it wouldn't be the same. She'd be in someone else's house, someone else's memories, but I didn't care. I just wanted something close, something that felt like her. And I found one. Not in the first store or the second, but the 7th. She was sitting on a dusty shelf, surrounded by piles of forgotten toys, her fur matted and one ear missing. She wasn't Floppy Bunny, but she was close enough. I picked her up and, for a second, I could feel that old sense of safety again. That quiet, warm magic that makes you think, even for a moment, that everything's going to be okay. I took her home, patched her up as best as I could, and now she sits on the shelf in my bedroom, right next to my deck of cards. Every so often, I catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, and it's like she's nodding at me again, the way she used to. It's funny, isn't it? The way we outgrow things, only to realize later that maybe we didn't outgrow them at all. Maybe we just forgot how much we needed them. So, here's my question. What's the one thing from your past you'd give anything to hold on to again, even for just a little while? It started with a button, a plain old shirt button, white with a tiny crack running through the middle. I found it in the back of a drawer in my shop. One of those little wooden drawers I keep loose needles and scraps of thread in, not because I sew much, but because you never know when a vintage jacket might need a quick fix. The thing had probably been rattling around in there for years, but when I saw it, I froze. I knew exactly where it came from. It was off Dad's Sunday shirt. I was maybe 9 years old when that button popped off. He was leaning over the sink, shaving with one of those ancient razors that looked like a weapon from the Middle Ages. I was sitting on the edge of the tub, pretending to read the comic section of the paper, but mostly watching him. His reflection in the mirror was bigger than life. This wiry man with hands that could build a porch or tune up a busted engine, yet somehow didn't look out of place holding a tiny paintbrush when he worked on his model trains. Dad was meticulous about those trains. He had an entire setup in the basement, a little town complete with tracks winding through mountains made of painted styrofoam. He'd spend hours down there, fixing up engines or painting trees to make them look more realistic. Every time he finished a piece, he'd say, "What do you think, bud?" And I'd nod, even if I didn't get why a plastic tree needed 3 shades of green. Anyway, back to the button. That morning, Dad was getting ready for church, and the button popped right off while he was trying to tuck his shirt in. He held it up like it had personally insulted him, muttering something about cheap stitching. Then he handed it to me and said, "Hang on to this, will you? I'll sew it back on later." Spoiler, he didn't sew it back on later. Life got in the way like it always does. And somehow, that button ended up in my pocket, then in a junk drawer, then in the shop, waiting for me to find it 40 years later. When I held it again, everything came flooding back. The smell of his shaving cream, the hum of his electric razor, the way his tie was always just a little crooked no matter how many times Mom straightened it. I remember the Sundays we'd spend together after church, grabbing cheeseburgers from that little diner on Main Street and arguing over whether Johnny Cash was better than Merle Haggard. For the record, I was Team Merle. Dad thought I was nuts. I also remembered the last time I ever saw him wear that shirt. It was a few years later at my high school graduation. By then, the shirt was a little snug on him, and it was missing that one button. He wore it anyway. I could see the gap it left right above his belt, but I didn't say anything. He looked proud, prouder than I'd ever seen him, and I wasn't about to ruin the moment by pointing out his wardrobe malfunction. Dad passed away not long after that, a heart attack while he was fixing a neighbor's deck. I didn't keep much of his stuff, just a few things like his favorite wrench and a broken pocket watch he always swore he'd fix someday. But I didn't think about that button. Not until now. Here's the kicker. Finding that button didn't make me sad. It made me laugh. Because that's the thing about Dad. He had this way of making even the smallest, most random things feel important. Like he once spent an entire afternoon teaching me how to skip rocks. And for weeks afterward, every flat rock I saw felt like treasure. That button? It's just a little piece of plastic, but it feels like him. So, I did something kind of dumb. I sewed it onto the sleeve of my jacket. Not because it matches, it sticks out like a sore thumb, but because every time I see it, I think of him. I think of those trains in the basement and the smell of cheeseburgers and how he always called me Bud like it was my real name. Funny how something so small can hold so much, isn't it? A button, a rock, an old train ticket. They're just objects, but they're also memories sitting there quietly until you stumble across them again. What about you? What's the smallest, most random thing that's ever brought someone you love back to you? Not metaphorically, a literal flesh and feathers, gobble gobble turkey. And before you ask, no, it wasn't Thanksgiving, and no, I didn't eat it. But it did teach me something about the kind of person I want to be, which frankly was a surprise to both me and the turkey. So, it was late spring, and I was driving back from an estate sale in the next town over. I'd gone in search of vintage books and left with exactly nothing except mild embarrassment because the woman running the sale caught me muttering, Who keeps a taxidermy squirrel next to Little Women? Anyway, there I was cruising down the highway, sipping my iced coffee, and feeling like the world's lamest treasure hunter when I saw it. The turkey. It was standing smack in the middle of the road, looking like it owned the place. And not just standing, mind you, strutting, chest puffed out, tail fanned like it was auditioning for some turkey version of America's Got Talent. Behind it, a growing line of cars had slowed to a crawl, all of us apparently too baffled to honk. At first, I laughed. I mean, it's not every day you see a bird holding up traffic like it's got somewhere important to be. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The turkey wasn't just blocking traffic. It was circling a smaller bird, a little brown fluff ball with stubby wings, like some kind of overprotective bodyguard. "That's a baby," I said to absolutely no one, because of course I was alone in the car. "Oh my God, it's a turkey, Mom." By this point, people were starting to get impatient. A guy in a pickup truck swerved around the scene, yelling something I couldn't quite hear, but which definitely involved the phrase, "stupid bird." The turkey flapped its wings at him, and I swear, it looked offended. I should have kept driving. That's what a normal person would have done. But instead, I pulled over to the side of the road because apparently I'm the kind of lunatic who can't resist getting involved in avian drama. The turkey glared at me as I got out of the car, its beady little eyes practically screaming, "You want some of this?" I held up my hands like I was negotiating with a very small, very angry mafia boss. "Look," I said, inching closer. "I'm just here to help, okay? You've got places to be, I've got places to be. Let's figure this out." The turkey, unsurprisingly, did not respond. But the little one, let's call it Nugget, peeped loudly and flailed its tiny wings like it was auditioning for the Lion King. Nugget was clearly stuck, caught on a patch of loose gravel at the edge of the road. So there I was, standing in the middle of a highway, trying to figure out how to rescue a baby turkey without getting murdered by its mom. Meanwhile, the line of cars was getting longer, and people were starting to honk. One guy rolled down his window to yell, "It's just a turkey, lady," as if that was helpful. Eventually, I decided to go for it. I crouched low, scooted toward Nugget, and, very gently, scooped it up. It weighed basically nothing, just a handful of warm fluff and frantic peeps. "All right, little guy," I whispered. "Let's get you out of here." I carried Nugget across the road and set it down in a patch of tall grass on the other side, where the turkey mom was already waiting, her wings spread wide like she was ready to fight me to the death if I so much as sneezed in her direction. I backed away slowly, hands still raised, and watched as the two of them waddled off together into the woods. By the time I got back to my car, the traffic had cleared and the honking had stopped. But I was still standing there, watching the tree lean, feeling weirdly emotional, like I'd just been part of something bigger than myself, even if that something was just helping a baby turkey not die on a Tuesday afternoon. Here's the thing, I'm not usually a stop-and-help kind of person. I mean, I'm nice enough, I hold doors open, donate to food drives, that sort of thing, but when it comes to the big stuff, I've always kind of assumed someone else will handle it. Someone smarter, braver, more capable than me. But that day, it hit me. Sometimes there isn't anyone else. Sometimes it's just you and a turkey in the middle of the road, and you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be. So yeah, that's the story of how a turkey made me rethink my entire life. Do I still have days where I feel like a chaotic mess who can barely keep her plants alive? Absolutely. But now, whenever I'm tempted to think, this isn't my problem, I remember Nugget and his terrifying mom. And I ask myself, what if it is? What about you? Have you ever had a moment where you stepped up to help, even when you didn't think you could? Or maybe just a funny run-in with wildlife? Either way, I want to hear about it, especially if it involves turkeys. Those birds are wild. Literally. I woke up to the sound of birds laughing. Not chirping laughing. Big, cackling laughs. The kind you hear at a bad open mic night after someone drops the mic for the third time. My first thought was that it was a weird dream, but when I rolled over to check my phone, the screen blinked to life with the words, "Finally. Took you long enough." I frowned. My phone never talked to me. Sure, it had notifications and all that, but this was new. Before I could process it, the voice, my phone's voice, apparently spoke again. "You're gonna need coffee. Trust me." I groggily sat up, and Moose, my dog, was already at the foot of the bed, staring at me. Not the usual feed me stare, but something sharper. It was like he was waiting for me to figure something out. When I didn't, he sighed, an actual human-like sigh, and padded out of the room. When I got to the kitchen, the coffee pot was mid-conversation with the fridge. "I'm telling you, he's not going to clean the filter until next month," the coffee pot said, voice high and whiny. "And I'm telling you," the fridge replied in a deep, almost regal tone, "he's going to leave the door open again while he debates over leftovers." "Excuse me?" I said, pointing at them like a teacher catching students passing notes. "Oh, he speaks," the coffee pot exclaimed. We're all thrilled. Truly. Before I could respond, the toaster butted in. "Are you going to burn the bread again today? Or will you finally figure out the difference between golden brown and charcoal?" Okay, that was uncalled for. At this point, I decided to take my phone's advice and make coffee, but every step was like being heckled by a comedy club audience. The spoon complained about being sticky. The sugar jar asked if I'd ever considered cutting back a little. Even the water filter threw shade. "Do you ever stop to wonder how hard I work to keep you hydrated?" By the time I sat down at the table with my mug, I wasn't sure if I was awake or trapped in some whimsical punishment for ignoring my chores. Moose hopped onto the chair across from me and stared. "What?" I asked. "You're taking this pretty well," Moose said, his voice gruff but oddly soothing. "Most people freak out when this starts." "What starts?" "You know," he said, waving a paw vaguely. "The whole everything has feelings thing. It's not permanent. Usually." "Usually?" Moose shrugged. "Depends on you." I didn't know what that meant, but before I could press him, my hiking boots stomped in from the mudroom. "Yes, stomped. Look who's finally home," the left boot grumbled. "We've been waiting for weeks. You used to take us places, remember? Trails? Rivers? Mud? Any of this ringing a bell?" The right boot snorted. "Good luck. He probably doesn't even remember how to lace us properly anymore." "Okay, first of all," I said, pointing at the boots, "I've been busy. Second, I just went hiking last weekend. Walking to your car doesn't count," the left boot shot back. "Brutal," Moose muttered, clearly enjoying this. Despite the constant commentary, I decided to go for a walk, partly to clear my head, partly to avoid any more judgment from my appliances. Moose tagged along, his tail wagging in a way that felt suspiciously smug. Outside, things were somehow both quieter and weirder. The mailbox grumbled about all the junk mail it had to hold. The sidewalk cracked a joke about how I really let myself go since the last time I jogged. And the wind? Oh, the wind was a full-blown diva, whipping my hat off and giggling as it carried it down the street. "Nice reflexes," it said, swirling around me. "Ever think about getting a haircut? You'd be more aerodynamic." Moose barked and the wind darted off, leaving me to chase my hat, which had landed on a parked car that was not happy about it. "Excuse you," the car said, its headlights flickering in annoyance. "Do I look like a hat rack?" "Sorry," I muttered, grabbing the hat and jamming it back on my head. As we wandered into the park, the trees began murmuring. Not like in my usual hikes, where the wind in the leaves sounds like whispers. This was full-on gossip. "Look who's finally back," one said, its voice deep and slow. "Probably here for the view," another snickered. "He never stays long. But he doesn't even climb trees anymore," a third one chimed in. All right, I said, throwing up my hands. "I get it. I've been distracted. Life happens, okay?" The trees didn't answer, but the grass hummed approvingly when I sat down, its soft blades cushioning me like a giant green pillow. Moose flopped next to me, his tongue lolling in a grin. "You're doing better than most," he said. "Most what?" "Most humans," Moose replied. "You're not running away screaming. You're not pretending this isn't happening. You're just here, listening." I glanced around at the park, the swaying trees, the babbling brook, even the distant skyline of the city. And for the first time, it all felt alive in a way I'd never noticed before. Not just alive, but connected. Like every rock and blade of grass and patch of sky had been waiting for me to see them properly. "Is this what it's like for you?" I asked Moose. He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "Being aware of everything. All the voices. All the feelings." Moose let out a thoughtful huff. "Sort of, but we dogs don't overthink it like you do. We just listen when it matters." I let that sink in as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in warm, golden light. The wind ruffled my hair, not mocking this time, just gentle. When we finally walked home, the house was quieter, though the fridge hummed a tune as I grabbed a snack, and the couch groaned playfully when I flopped onto it. Moose curled up beside me, snoring softly, and I realized I didn't mind the voices anymore. So, if this were you, if everything in your life suddenly had something to say, how do you think you'd handle it? And what do you think they'd say about you? It's 2 years ago, and I'm sitting at my favorite coffee shop, a little place on the east side of Austin that somehow manages to smell like cinnamon and regret at the same time. I'm hunched over my laptop, trying to fix a bug that's making my NPCs walk backward like they're in some kind of cursed moonwalk simulator. I'm in the zone, headphones in, drowning in lo-fi beats and my own frustration, when suddenly, out of nowhere, someone taps me on the shoulder. I hate being tapped on the shoulder. It's such an aggressive way to say, hey, pay attention to me. So I turn around, fully prepared to glare this person into oblivion. And there she is, this whirlwind of messy hair, oversized cardigan, and the brightest yellow rain boots I've ever seen. She's holding a notebook covered in doodles and looking at me like I'm the answer to some weirdly specific crossword clue. Hey, she says, like we're old friends. Quick question, are you using the Wi-Fi? Now, I'm not proud of this, but my brain went straight to who even asked that? It's a coffee shop. Everyone's using the Wi-Fi. I nodded, hoping that would be the end of it. But no. She plopped down in the seat across from me without waiting for an invite and said, cool, because I think I just broke it. You blinkte here. You broke the Wi-Fi? She grinned, completely unbothered. Maybe. I was trying to download this massive file for my thesis. And now my laptop's doing that thing where the spinning wheel looks like it's judging you. So I figured I'd ask if it's just me, or if I doomed the entire cafe. I stared at her for a solid 5 seconds, trying to decide if she was joking or if she was just one of those chaotic people who moves through life leaving a trail of mild destruction. Turns out it was both. It's working fine for me, I said, gesturing at my laptop. Maybe your computer just hates you? She laughed like I just told the funniest joke in the world, which was weirdly disarming. Probably. It's been giving me divorce cord vibes lately. Anyway, thanks for the update, Wi-Fi Guardian. And then she just left. I thought that was it. Just a random, slightly unhinged encounter to add to the list of reasons I should start working from home more. But no, the universe had other plans. The next week, I'm back at the coffee shop because apparently I don't learn. And guess who walks in? Yellow rain boots. She spotted me immediately, waved like we were lifelong pals, and said, hey, Wi-Fi guy, good news. I didn't break it this time. I managed a weak smile and went back to my work, hoping she'd sit somewhere else. No such luck. She marched right over and dropped her stuff onto the table next to mine, then started pulling out highlighters in at least 8 different colors. At this point, I was torn between annoyance and morbid curiosity. Who was this person? Why was she so comfortable invading my bubble? And why the hell did she have so many highlighters? Finally, she noticed me side-eyeing her stationary explosion and said, I'm Emma, by the way. I'm working on my thesis. It's about narrative structures in indie games. You look like someone who might know about that stuff. That got my attention. Narrative structures in indie games? I repeated, like, as an academic thing? She nodded, flipping open her notebook to reveal pages of messy diagrams and scribbled notes. Yeah, I'm studying how indie games tell stories in non-traditional ways. You know, like Firewatch or Outer Wilds. It's kind of a passion project that turned into a research project. Now, I don't usually talk to strangers, especially ones who bulldoze their way into my personal space. But something about the way she lit up when she talked about games made me forget how annoyed I was. We ended up spending the next hour geeking out over our favorite titles. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't chaotic for the sake of it. She was just full of energy. The kind of person who loves everything loudly and unapologetically. Over the next few weeks, Emma became a regular fixture in my coffee shop routine. She'd show up with her rain boots and her highlighters, plop down at the table next to mine, and immediately launch into some random tangent about whatever obscure game she'd been playing. One day, She brought me a box of donuts as a peace offering for the whole shoulder tap incident, and I made the mistake of joking that my plants were jealous they didn't get any. The next day, she showed up with a tiny potted succulent and said, "This one's for your team. It's a morale booster." It's still sitting on my desk. I named it Boots. What really sealed the deal, though, was the day she asked if I'd playtest a little prototype she was working on. It was this simple, text-based game where you play as a lost sock trying to find its way back to the laundry basket. It was weird and whimsical and surprisingly emotional, and I ended up sitting there for an hour, giving her feedback while she scribbled notes like a mad scientist. That's when it hit me. Emma wasn't just some chaotic whirlwind of doodles and rain boots. She was ridiculously talented, endlessly curious, and the kind of person who makes you see the world in brighter colors. Now, 2 years later, Emma's one of my closest friends. We still meet at that same coffee shop, though she swapped the rain boots for equally obnoxious rainbow sneakers. We've even collaborated on a few game projects, including her sock game, which is now a full-blown indie title with an actual fan base. Looking back, I can't believe I almost dismissed her as some random annoying stranger. Turns out, sometimes the people who crash into your life with no warning are exactly the ones you didn't know you needed. Have you ever met someone who completely changed your first impression of them? Because honestly, I feel like it's one of the coolest surprises life has to offer. Here's a confession I've never said out loud, but I'm pretty sure my friends suspect it anyway. Whenever I have a crush on someone, and I mean whenever, I start curating an imaginary museum exhibit about them in my head, like full-on displays with plaques and everything. I'm not talking about, "Oh, they have nice hair," and moving on. No, I'm building a whole gallery dedicated to their existence. It's weird, it's obsessive, but it's also kind of sweet. Maybe? Okay, probably not. It starts small. Let's say I meet someone new, like this girl I met at a party a few months ago. Her name was Alina, and she had this soft way of talking, like she was afraid her words might break if they landed too hard. She mentioned she worked at a plant nursery, which instantly sent my brain spiraling into Exhibit A, the botanic wonders of Alina. I imagine a room filled with hanging ivy and succulents, with little signs that said things like, "Alina, 29, is known for her ability to keep even the most temperamental fiddle leaf fig alive. Legend has it she once rescued a dying cactus just by whispering to it." I know how it sounds, but to me it's kind of like a mental Pinterest board, except instead of saving ideas for kitchen remodels, I'm cataloging every adorable thing they do. If they laugh at one of my bad jokes, that moment goes straight into the audio-visual section of the exhibit, complete with a looping video of their smile. If I notice they always wear that one beat-up leather jacket, it gets its own display under iconic wardrobe staples, right next to a carefully recreated mannequin. And if they say something weirdly specific like, "I hate people who eat bagels without toasting them first," you bet that's going on a plaque labeled "Quirky Opinions that prove they're a genius." The thing is, this mental museum doesn't just happen during the fun, flirty phase. Oh no, it thrives in the awkward moments, too. Like, there was this guy, Jason, who I had a crush on for weeks before I finally worked up the courage to talk to him at a mutual friend's dinner party. When I did, the first thing out of my mouth was, "Hey, you smell good." He just kind of laughed and said, "Thanks," and I panicked and said, "No, I mean like not in a weird way. It's just clean, like fresh laundry." Then I fake coughed so hard I had to leave the room. You'd think my brain would let that moment die, but nope. It got its own interactive exhibit, where visitors could press a button to hear my disastrous attempt at a compliment. I imagined a speaker playing back my awkward fresh laundry line on loop with a sign that said, "The artist attempts to connect and fails gloriously." But here's where it gets really weird. If I'm really into someone, my imaginary museum starts branching out into future exhibits. Like if we were to date, hypothetically, of course, what kinds of moments would I put in the relationship milestones wing? First concert together? First road trip? A wall dedicated to the time they let me eat the last slice of pizza, even though they were hungry too? The possibilities are endless, and I'm not saying I plan our entire life in advance, but okay, fine, I absolutely do that. One time, it backfired in real life. I was hanging out with a girl I'd been seeing for a couple of weeks, and she mentioned she had a habit of keeping weird ticket stubs, like from movies, concerts, even parking garages, because they reminded her of good memories. In my head, I immediately added a memorabilia section to her exhibit. imagining it filled with a shadow box of her stubs and little notes about why each one mattered. I got so caught up in the idea that I blurted out, "That's so cool. I could make you like a whole scrapbook about it." Her face froze. She just stared at me and said, we've only been on 3 dates. Yeah, that was the last time I saw her. Turns out, some people find a museum thing charming, and some people think it's a fast track to Stalkerville. I get it, but you know what? I think part of me loves the museum idea because it makes me pay attention. Like, really pay attention. When I start building these imaginary displays, it's not just about the big, obvious stuff like how gorgeous they are or how they light up a room. It's about the details. The way they tap their foot when they're thinking. How they always tilt their head when they're telling a story, like they're making sure you're following along. The way their voice gets softer when they're talking about something they love. It's all these little things that most people might not even notice, but to me, they're everything. They're what makes someone unforgettable. And yeah, maybe it's a little over the top to imagine turning those quirks into a full-blown exhibit, complete with overpriced gift shop merch. But at least it means I'm noticing the things that matter, right? Anyway, that's my weird little quirk, turning every crush into a museum-worthy masterpiece in my head. What about you? Do you have any strange habits when it comes to liking someone? Like, do you keep a running list of their favorite songs, or low-key try to bump into them at their favorite coffee shop? Please tell me I'm not the only one out here building imaginary galleries for people who barely know I exist. You ever get hit by a frisbee so hard it changes your life? No. Just me? Cool. Let me tell you about it anyway. It was one of those freakishly warm days in February, where Brooklyn collectively decides to pretend it's spring. People were out in droves, dogs were off their leashes, and there was a line at every coffee shop like we'd all forgotten how to survive the winter without oat milk. I just finished my shift and was heading to Prospect Park to clear my head. You see, I'd been in a rut. The kind of rut where your brain's like, "Hey, remember all those dreams you had? Yeah, let's sit in the dark and think about how you're not doing any of them." So, there I was walking aimlessly through the park, dodging joggers and kids on scooters when I heard it. The whoop of a frisbee cutting through the air. Before I could react, something smacked me right in the temple. Hard. I staggered, clutching my face, half expecting to look down and see a tooth or a piece of my dignity lying on the ground. Instead, I saw the frisbee, bright orange, obnoxiously neon, lying in the grass like it was proud of what it had done. A guy came running over, out of breath and grinning sheepishly. "Oh man, I am so sorry," he said, picking up the frisbee. He looked like he just walked out of an LL Bean catalog, all flannel and good hair. I was aiming for my buddy, and, well, clearly I suck at aiming. I stared at him, still holding my temple. Clearly. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking genuinely concerned. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. "Unless this is the part where I wake up in the hospital and find out I'm married to you now." He laughed, a real, hearty laugh, and held out his hand. "I'm done?" "Great," I said, ignoring his hand. "Tell your frisbee," I said, "thanks for the existential crisis." He laughed again and offered to buy me a coffee as an apology. Normally, I'd say no, but my head was throbbing, and the idea of caffeine sounded like the only way to salvage my day. Plus, I figured, worst case scenario, I could roast him for his frisbee crimes while I drank. We ended up at this tiny cafe near the park, the kind of place that serves drinks in mason jars and has way too many succulents. I was still rubbing my temple, and Dan was nervously stirring his latte like it was a magic potion. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he said, "Okay, I have to ask, what's an existential crisis about a frisbee?" I smirked. "It's not about the frisbee, exactly. It's just, you ever have one of those days where you're already questioning every decision you've ever made, and then life hits you in the face? Literally?" "Ah," he said, nodding. "One of those days." I told him about the comedy thing, about how I'd been doing stand-up for years but still felt stuck in the playing for drink tickets and half-empty bars phase. How every time I thought about quitting, it felt like I'd be giving up on the one thing that made sense in my life. And how every time I thought about sticking with it, it felt like I was signing up for a lifetime of rejection. Dan listened, his head tilted slightly to the side, like he was trying to figure me out. When I finished, he set down his spoon and said, I used to play Ultimate Frisbee." I blinked at him. "I'm sorry. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "Hang on," he said, laughing. "Let me explain. I was obsessed with it. Played in college, joined leagues after graduation, even thought about going pro. I was all in, but then one day, during a game, I twisted my ankle so bad I couldn't walk for weeks. And while I was laid up, I realized I wasn't actually enjoying it anymore. I was just doing it because I thought I had to, because I'd invested so much time and energy into it that quitting felt like failing." "Okay," I said, intrigued despite myself. "So, what did you do?" "I quit," he said simply. "But I didn't stop playing. I just stopped trying to make it my whole identity. Now I just play for fun. No pressure, no expectations. It's honestly way better this way." I stared at him for a moment, trying to decide if he was a genius or just a guy who wanted to justify hitting me in the head. "So, you're saying I should quit comedy?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm saying maybe you don't have to put so much pressure on yourself. Maybe it's okay to just enjoy it for what it is right now." I didn't know what to say to that, because honestly, he wasn't wrong. I'd been treating comedy like this mountain I had to climb, this thing that would only matter if I made it. But I didn't start doing it to make it. I started because I loved it, because it made me feel alive, even when nothing else did. We finished our coffee, and Dan gave me the Frisbee as a souvenir, which I thought was ridiculous but kind of perfect. "Just in case you ever need a reminder to stop taking yourself so seriously," he said with a grin. That night, I did a set at a tiny bar in Bushwick, the kind of place where half the audience is comics waiting for their turn. But instead of doing my usual polished but forced routine, I told the story about getting hit in the face with a Frisbee. About how life is a way of smacking you upside the head when you're too busy overthinking it. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to be clever or impressive. I was just honest. And people laughed. Not because it was the best set ever, but because it was real. The Frisbee is still in my apartment, propped up on a shelf next to my comedy notebook. Every time I see it, I think about that day in the park, about how sometimes life forces you to pause and recalibrate, and about how occasionally the thing that knocks you off course might be exactly what you needed. You ever have a moment like that? Where life just throws something ridiculous at you, and somehow it ends up making everything make sense? Because I've got to say, getting hit in the face by a Frisbee turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me. Who knew?